John, we could probably go ahead and get started. It's 9 o'clock. Mimi, do you want to bring folks into the meeting?
We'll get them going.
All right, good morning, everybody. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission meeting via Zoom on October 27th, 2020. It is 9 a.m. Our commissioners are present. We are undertaking the 900 series rulemaking. We had staff presentation yesterday followed by public comment, and today we will start with party presentations. Before we roll into all of this, we will take the roll. Hearings Manager Larson, if we could undertake the roll, please.
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Bogue.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Putnam. Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 6 out of 7 commissioners present.
Okay, great. Great to have everybody present again. Look forward to today's party presentations on the 900 series rulemaking. I believe that our agenda has us starting out with a 5-minute presentation from the parties that are 350 Colorado and the Lookout Alliance.
That is correct, and we will get those panelists in just a moment. And I just wanted to make one announcement with respect to the agenda. I sent out a corrected agenda to parties and commissioners yesterday afternoon, and that was an error. I had misunderstood a question that came in, and so that agenda that was sent out yesterday on October 26th provided additional time to Westlake, Koga, and Karis for this afternoon. And in fact, that's not correct. Westlake, Koga, and Karis, their time is with industry. So apologies for the confusion, but the agenda that is dated October 23rd is correct and accurate. So.
Okay, that's not a problem. We will go with the October 23rd agenda. That's the one I think that I've got on my desk, and it does not have Westlake, Koga, and Karis on their own. So great.
Super.
And Chair, if I may, before we jump into party presentations.
Yeah, Director Murphy, good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Coloradans.
Opening remarks for us, or
not an
comments,
opening remark so much as a following up on a commissioner question yesterday, asking to put together some folks to answer questions about the Las Animas County related produced water pit wildlife water quality question. I've been in touch with folks from CPW and with Evergreen, and I need to follow up with CDPHE, but we're trying to get those folks together to be available to answer commissioner questions. I'm thinking maybe before the lunch break tomorrow makes the most sense, so that we get through the schedule as proposed, parties present about the time they expect, and then commissioners can hear about this issue before closing statements begin. So that's what I'm working towards, but wanted to follow up and let you know the status update. So.
That sounds great. So we'll have a defined set aside for commissioners to have a discussion on the issues that were raised from various constituents yesterday.
Yes.
That's like a really good working plan. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all commissioners are appreciative of putting that together.
Great, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I should be able to share my screen if you're able to do that.
Yes, all panelists have that authority, so you should be able to do that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. Great. Okay. Well, looks like my screen is just loading. Thank you all so much. My name is Micaela Mujica Steiner. I am with 350 Colorado in the Lookout Alliance, and I'm just going to pass it straight to our expert witness, Justin Noble, to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Mikael. I appreciate the Commission's effort here to address the presence of dangerous radionuclides in this rulemaking, but unfortunately, the rules remain insufficient. I don't think the Commission fully understands one, and if we can go to the next slide. One, the long arc of industry and government documents detailing harms. Two, the inherent sloppiness of this industry. Three, the very real harms posed to oil and gas workers. Four, suspected harms posed to members of the public living near wellheads, natural gas processing plants, compressor stations. Next slide. I want to focus on treatment, and I point you to a 1982 report of the American Petroleum Institute, which invalidates the idea that complex oil and gas waste streams can simply be recycled or treated. Quote, any control methodology proposed for radioactive materials must recognize the fact that radioactivity cannot be modified or made inert by chemical means. Decay to daughter products cannot be guaranteed to reduce the hazard, and any attempt to remove radioactivity is merely transforming, quote, a very dilute source of radioactive materials into a very concentrated source of radioactivity. Next slide. Radium-226, radium-228, and lead-210 must be added to the cleanup concentrations in Table 9.15.1. EPA's own webpage on oil and gas production waste clearly indicate levels are extraordinary. Radium concentrations in the mineral scales that form on the inside of wellhead piping and water lines have been recorded as high as 400,000 picocuries per gram. That's 80,000 times limit set for topsoil at Superfund sites. Lead-210, one of the more long-lived decay products of radium-226, has been recorded in tank bottom sludges at 27,000 picocuries per gram, some 12,273 times limit suggested by EPA for soil cleanup at nuclear weapons manufacturing plants. Next slide. Pumps, valves, and filters from pipeline infrastructure and associated natural gas and NGL facilities cleaned by machine shop workers must be tested for lead-210 and polonium-210. This equipment is sent through the U.S. Postal Service and other mail providers to machine shops far from the oil field, where inappropriately protected workers remove scale that, unbeknownst to them, can be highly radioactive. Quoting from a 1993 article on norm contamination in the petroleum industry, published by the preeminent Society of Petroleum Engineers. Machine shops present a special norm situation. The grinding may generate significant quantities of radioactive dust that can contaminate personnel as well as the shop facility. Next slide. And this is critically important. In my reporting, it has become clear that despite well-known radioactivity risks acknowledged by leading industry firms, U.S. oil and gas workers are still not properly protected. Here is a wonderfully detailed and concerning graphic from a 2016 report of the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. Next slide. Again, after extensive time speaking with community members and workers in oil and gas plays in Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado, it has become clear they are not informed of these known risks. Here we have a very disturbing example of that. I'm going to pause so you can read the slide. Worker here in Ohio. I know of similar stories in other plays. It's difficult for me to believe these types of jobs and exposures are not occurring in Colorado as well. Next slide. Emissions at the wellhead, natural gas processing plants, and compressor stations must be regularly tested for radon, lead-210, and polonium-210. Again, if you follow the industry's own articles from 40 years ago, it's evident radon comes up at the wellhead, is inevitably flared along with methane, and travels in the natural gas and NGL pipeline systems. A good digital radon detector costs less than a smartphone. So why is radon, the second leading cause of lung cancer deaths in the US, not being tested at all points of emission? No good reason. Next slide. And interesting new research came out just last month. More is in the works. I strongly suggest regulators begin gathering their own data on this. Next slide. Just to show you all how easy it is, pictured here is the cover of the very first occurrence of oil and gas radioactivity in the scientific literature, a 1904 Canadian study from the oil fields outside Petrolia, Ontario. If industry actually granted access, a high school science class could repeat this elegant and highly informative study today. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions, and let's go to the next slide and leave it on our recommendations.
Yeah, thank you so much, Justin. And these are recommended rule changes. There are a lot, and so we're happy to answer any questions you may have about this, and we'll also email the PowerPoint as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, could you bring that slide back up on the recommended
Yes.
changes?
Yeah.
And I just kind of want to ask you an open-ended question, if you could just spend a little time and walk us through your proposed changes.
Yeah, definitely. So the first proposed rule change that we would like to see, our understanding is that the only time that produced water is analyzed for radium-226 and 228 is when the produced water from the well is placed into a permitted or registered pit. And we would really like to see any discharge from the treatment, recycling, and reuse facility handling oil and gas waste or sewage treatment plant to also be regularly analyzed for these components. Do you want to speak to that at all, Justin, as well?
Or if you'd like me to, yeah, I can just weigh in. I
Sure.
mean,
Yeah.
I know in Colorado, there's known instances of brine trucks, water trucks carrying produced water spilling. This happens on public roads. There's crops growing beside these roads. There's people using these roads. So I think it's great to test in pits. I think that's a really good start in learning the radioactive signature of produced water in Colorado. But I do think there's many other instances in which testing is appropriate. And at treatment and recycling and reuse facilities, I really want to hone in on that. Again, this is something when the American Petroleum Institute looked at norm in oil and gas, they were really concerned. I read that quote, and they basically point out, you can't do magic here. You simply can't remove radioactivity. And if you do so successfully, you inherently have concentrated radioactivity, and you now have a potentially greater problem on your hand. So I think facilities treating produced water, there really needs to be appropriate testing. Often they end up with a sludge at the bottom of different tanks. That sludge needs to be tested. We need to know what's happening there. And again, the first line of risk is going to be the workers who are working at these plants. In my experience, they are entirely uninformed about the risks posed to the radioactivity that they're dealing with.
Okay, did you continue down through your 6 proposed changes?
And then our second proposed change is that radium-226, radium-228, and lead-210 must be added to the cleanup concentrations in table 915.1. That's stated in the rules. Our third suggestion is that any plant recycling or treating produced water or other oil and gas waste must have tank sludge and adjacent soils regularly tested for radium-226, radium-228, lead-210, and polonium-210. Our fourth recommendation is that pumps, valves, and filters from pipeline infrastructure and associated natural gas and NGL facilities that are cleaned by machine shop workers be tested for lead-210 and polonium-210.
And if I'll just mention something quick, because I think this is it's actually quite complicated, and it takes a bit of probing to understand, well, why is this infrastructure contaminated? What's happening is you have radon gas moving through the natural gas pipeline and the NGL pipeline system. So just like your kitchen sink, when there's a change in pressure or a change in direction, often gunk builds in the pipes. You have this through the pipeline system, and the valves, filters, and pumps in a pipeline, at a compressor station, at a natural gas processing plant, these things can become really highly contaminated. Again, this is something well documented in the industry literature. And often these pumps and valves, they have to be cleaned. You can't run a product through a gunked up pump or valve. So that will be sent off site. And I think it's really easy to miss that exposure pathway. I know of facilities in Colorado that actually clean this equipment. It's a complicated job, and a machine expert has to intricately, handle this equipment. And unfortunately, they're not informed that the material that they're cleaning or scraping off the pump or valve can be radioactive. And again, as this old industry document conveys, dust is created, and they could be breathing in that dust, and that's a really dangerous exposure pathway. So I think we want to make certain that this kind of overlooked exposure pathway is addressed by the commission.
Great. And then our fifth rule recommendation is that pigging waste removed from natural gas and NGL pipelines must be regularly tested for lead-210 and polonium-210 and soil at pig launch and receiver sites must be tested for these constituents as well. And then our sixth recommendation is that emissions at the wellhead and fence lines, which separate the wellhead, natural gas processing plants and compressor stations must, from residential or pedestrian commercial areas, must be regularly tested for radon, lead-210, and polonium-210.
Great, thank you. Appreciate giving you a little bit of extra time to be able to work through your proposed recommended rule changes. I'm now looking at the my other commissioners to see if there are other specific questions from your presentation. Commissioner Gowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your time this morning. I think I'm curious to know where OSHA kicks in for worker safety and where the responsibility for the commission lies as far as testing things and ensuring worker safety. And some of these things seem like they might be OSHA related, but I'm not sure.
I can speak to that. It's a fantastic question. And unfortunately, OSHA is really absent from a lot of these jobs, of these circumstances. They're just not there. I mean, I'll give one example. One of the most worrisome jobs, and again, there's a long industry track record on this job. It's a job of pipe cleaning. So a radioactive scale will form in oil field piping, the downhole piping. Someone has to clean that out. So the pipe is taken out. The job is a quite dangerous job because the scale is hard. To clean it out creates dust. And again, there's a lot of, there can be quite a lot of radium in that dust. Breathing that in is quite dangerous. So there should be OSHA regulations on this. But if you look up OSHA's rules, all there is on that is a guidance. And the guidance itself is a letter from 1990 from OSHA to the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Quality in Louisiana asking about this, asking basically the question you just asked. So they asked the question, you know, where is OSHA here? And OSHA said, oh, this job does look concerning. And our recommendation is just for workers to not do this job, do this job as infrequently as they can because we are concerned. But there is no OSHA rule or that thoroughly addresses it. And I think it's a major problem. And I understand, for commissions in different states, it poses an issue because it's not necessarily your territory, but unfortunately, I think the federal authority here, OSHA, has dropped the ball on many of these issues.
Follow up, Commissioner McGowan. Okay. Other questions? All right, well, we thoroughly appreciate your testimony this morning. Thank you for putting together the PowerPoint. If we could get that emailed to Hearings Manager Larson, that would be great. And we'll have those recommendations as we move into deliberations after we've heard from all parties. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you all so much.
I think we're moving to Adams County at this point. Good morning, Ms. Fitch and Mr. Dean. Good to see you both again.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick, and then we'll get started. Can everyone see that? Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, Commissioners. Adams County supports the efforts of the COGCC to consider additions and amendments to the Commission's Rules of Practice and Procedure. Within Adams County alone, there has been at least one reportable spill or release every month for the last 2 years, resulting in the release of 75,000 gallons of oil, produced water, or E&P waste. The county is largely supportive of the draft rules for the 900 series and believes that the proposed regulations will protect the public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. However, the county has requested changes to the following subjects. Those subjects are venting and flaring during production operations, gas capture plans, cumulative impact studies, spills, releases, and remediation. Gregory Dean, our oil and gas liaison, will take it from here.
Thank you, Ms. Fitch. Good morning, commissioners. This is Greg Dean, Oil and Gas Liaison for Adams County. I'll be discussing our more specific requests within the 900 series. The first, the county appreciates the significant efforts by staff to incorporate the perspectives from varying parties and including many of the recommendations from the county into the official draft rules. Firstly, as it pertains to allowable venting and flaring, the county supports the recently added language in the rule allowing a one-time exception to allowable venting and flaring under 903D during production operations. However, the county does not agree with the position presented in the most recent draft and statement of basis and purpose that seemingly allows operators to vent and flare for an indeterminate amount of time past the proposed 12-month period with the granting of a variance under Rule 502. We believe this open-ended language does not conform or comport with the statutory obligation under 181 to reduce waste and protect public health, safety, welfare of the environment, and wildlife resources. As such, the county requests allowable venting and flaring during production to be limited to 6 cumulative months, with the opportunity for operators to request one additional 6-month extension from the director with a subsequent approval of a Form 4 and a gas capture plan. The county understands the position presented by staff that it may take operators time to evaluate their assets and connect facilities to a gas gathering infrastructure, but believes exceptions to venting and flaring standards should be granted in limited instances and for a finite amount of time. Operators have been provided ample notice from the commission's intentions to reduce allowable venting and flaring during production operations via the initial white paper released in November 2019 and in all subsequent straw dog draft rules and draft statements of basis and purpose. This request reduces waste and the release of CO2, greenhouse gases, HAPs, NOxes, and other pollutants into the atmosphere, which have impacts on all sensitive resources. Next slide, please. Next, related to gas capture plan pursuant to 903E, the county agrees with the position presented by commission staff that the gas capture plan will close a major regulatory gap associated with allowable venting and flaring standards and serve as an excellent mechanism to pre-plan the capture or beneficial use of natural gas in the partial fulfillment of a statutory obligation under 181. We are supportive of the proposal in 903E, including the submission requirements and other components of the GCP. However, requests that GCP be explicitly required for all requests for allowable venting and flaring at both existing facilities and proposed new facilities as part of the Form 2A. We seek clarification regarding the requirements for a gas capture plan as part of a Form 4 for venting and flaring associated with production operations under 903D3 and the conformance of such with the submission of a gas capture plan under Rule 903E. We request that direct reference to the requirements for a gas capture plan under 903E be included in the rule for production operations rather than the only limited information that is currently required in the proposed rules. Next slide. Under cumulative impact studies, the county is again supportive of proposed Rule 904, which can require operators to participate in studies that address all cumulative impacts in the partial fulfillment of 181. We, however, seek added clarification, potentially in the form of guidance documentation that addresses the scope, duration, scale, time frame, and other anticipated requirements of any studies required as a condition of approval for a Form 2A or an OGDP. This clarification will provide more certainty to stakeholders and ensure any data collected is comprehensive and representative. Additionally, the county further requests the rule language be modified to explicitly require any studies under 904 be conducted by COGCC, CDPHE, or other experts from federal, academic, consultant, non-governmental organization, and third parties in cooperation and coordination with operators, rather than being completed by operators directly, or under the which may be language as in proposed Rule 904B. As these studies will be used for future regulatory rulemaking and permit decision-making, this request provides assurance to all stakeholders and to the public that these studies are being done objectively and by qualified experts. Next slide. And finally, as it relates to spills, releases, and remediation in the 900 series, based on COGCC data from January 2019 through October 2020, there were over 1,000 reportable spills and releases in Colorado, resulting in the release of at least 1.5 million gallons of oil, produced water, or other E&P waste. And this number is only from those releases where the volume is known. In Adams County, 2/3 of all spills occurred during reclamation or abandonment operations, with most spill and release volumes being reported as unknown or indeterminable. Of the nearly 900 active well bores in the county, many are vertical wells. As horizontal development has increased, so has the number of older vertical wells being plugged and abandoned. And as this continues to be the primary operation type in Adams County going forward, this will undoubtedly lead to the discovery of additional historical spills and releases. Given this trend and the severe risks to the public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife related to spills and releases, the county advocates for robust standards and requirements for reporting and remediation, and wholeheartedly refutes the positions by other stakeholders who seemingly attempt to circumvent or reduce the efficacy of these rules. As such, we believe the director and this commission must maintain the broad and sweeping authority and discretion under 912A to require any and all necessary actions to immediately document, report, clean up spills and releases, and mitigate and remediate all impacts to air, soil, water, and other resources where applicable. The county respectfully requests the language in this rule remain unchanged as issued in the October 14th draft. Additionally, the county requests the reporting threshold for the discovery of impacted material not be increased above the proposed level of 10 cubic yards under Rule 912B1E, and appreciates the added clarification in the draft statement of basis and purpose regarding the rationale and justification for the reporting threshold of impacted material in this rule. Some parties have requested increasing the reporting threshold under this rule from the current level of 1 cubic yard to 100 cubic yards as the new minimum. The average commercial dump truck carries 10 cubic yards of soil, which roughly equates to 10 truckloads of contaminated material for a spill impacting 100 cubic yards. Exempting spills of this magnitude from reporting and remediation requirements, as requested by some industry parties, is not sufficiently protective and violates the intent of SB 181 to avoid adverse impacts. Next slide. The county further supports the inclusion of the enforceable implementation and reporting schedule for remediation of spills and releases under Rule 913D and 913E. There are currently 40 open remediation projects associated with spills and releases listed by the COGCC and Adams County. 40% of those projects have not had any reporting or updates submitted to the COGC in at least the last 18 months. And with many of those not providing any updates since the initial Form 27 submission. Some open remediation projects in the county have not had any updates or reporting to the commission or to the county in over a decade. This means these potentially unremediated spills could be continually having impacts on critical resources. As such, the county requests an added requirement in this rule for relevant local government consultation and notice pertaining to the determination and approval of project timelines prior to director approval of the Form 27. This request will ensure local governments are able to continually enforce their own local regulations under authority granted under 181 associated with documentable violations. Additionally, this will further allow local governments to enforce land use permits often associated with remediation and excavation projects. For example, the county can require conditional use, inert fill, stormwater control, access and oversized load, and other various construction permits related to these types of remediation projects. Lastly, this request will help local governments guide future land use planning activity and decision-making near ongoing remediation sites. The county further believes any request to extend or modify the implementation and reporting schedules should require additional relevant local government consultation and notice and only be granted by the director after an operator has clearly demonstrated measurable progress toward completing the project. Thank you for your consideration, and this concludes our testimony on the 900 series.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean and Ms. Fitch, for your presentation. We would hope that you would be able to get that emailed over to Hearings Manager Larson, at least the slides, and we turn to commissioners with any questions. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for that presentation. Always thoughtful comments coming from Adams County. I did have a few questions, though, to make sure I understand the asks. So first of all, regarding the 502 variance process for flaring or venting, and my understanding is, and I read it in your pre-hearing statements as well, is that you're proposing an allowable 6 month with an additional 6 month. The current rules state a one-time 12 month. I think there's some confusion as far as what that 502 variance would actually be, because I think the language in the variance clearly indicates that, you know, almost any rule within the COGCC regulatory process can be, a variance can be requested for that. There's a very high bar that it must meet in order to meet that variance, and certainly it's a discretion of the commission. It's certainly not a you know, an easy process to be able to request a variance and receive it so that they're going to be able to vent and flare in perpetuity. And so I do think there's some thought out there that it's just going to be a slam dunk, that folks are going to be able to request a variance and just be able to flare and vent in perpetuity. I mean, do you acknowledge that that 502 variance is a pretty challenging bar in order to be able to meet? And do you still have concerns about that?
I do acknowledge that a 502 variance process is a more robust process than, say, an exception granted by the director administratively. Our concern is without the certainty of knowing how long they're going to be granted such a variance, whether maybe the language in that rule would add a timeline for a variance. With the understanding that this commission has the ultimate authority to grant or deny any request for a variance. Our concern is that we support 12 months to give operators time to assess their assets and then to determine whether it's worth connecting to a gas infrastructure or not. But they've kind of already had the known intention of this commission to reduce allowable venting and flaring for almost a year already. And so our concern is they have a year already between when they were told and when the rules will likely become effective in mid-January, and then they're going to get 12 months on top of that, and then they could potentially request another variance for maybe another 12 months, another 6 months. We just want to make sure that if they are being granted variances for venting and flaring during production operations, that they've demonstrated that they're actually making progress to connecting. We understand construction schedules change, weather changes, things like that, logistical challenges, and we want to remain flexible for that as well. But we just want to make sure that the intention of that variance is not so that an operator can sit on their hands for another year and then request a variance for an additional year on top of that. We just want to make sure that they are making documentable progress. And I understand that the variance, this commission will be thoughtful in assessing those variance requests. We just want to make sure that it's on the record that we're concerned with that point.
No, and I appreciate that. I mean, just as I read the rules, I mean, in simplifying it horribly, it's, you know, venting and flaring is not allowed in production activities, period. There's a opportunity to be able to transition. That's that 12-month period. After that, it's not allowed. And so, just so you know where I'm coming from there. As far as the gas capture plans and the desire to have them required within the 2A, and this is a question because as I read it, it is required in the 2A application to have a gas capture plan and to understand how that gas is going to be captured and utilized. Are you reading it differently?
No, what the intent, and I apologize if I didn't clearly state my intention. I understand that it will be required as a part of the Form 2A or as part of the cumulative impacts under 304C19. So we're not concerned with that part of it. What we're concerned with is there's some added language in the most recent draft that we're seeking clarification on, because under 903D3, I believe, for production operations, it states that they'll have to submit a gas capture plan as part of a Form 4. But then under that, in the next sub-bullet, it lists only 3 requirements of that gas capture plan. And so we're just asking that the requirements for a gas capture plan under 903E be explicitly referenced in 903D3. So, so the same standard is going to apply as for the Form 2A and oil and gas development plan as it will for any subsequent request for venting and flaring that's allowable at existing infrastructure.
Okay.
So again, I apologize for not stating that clearly.
No, I'm just trying to make sure I understand. I appreciate that. My last question, and this is the spills and releases, so 912, 913. I mean, you had indicated that you're good with the October 14th draft. There's been an October 20th draft. I was unsure if there was a change between the October 14th and the October 20th you were uncomfortable with, or you're good with.
No, we like the changes that were made to the statement of basis and purpose that clarified why the commission staff was proposing a change from 1 cubic yard of impacted material to 10 cubic yards, because the county had previously in our previous pleadings requested that it be left at the current level of 1 cubic yard. And we still would prefer that, but we understand with the science and the equations that the staff presented, we're satisfied with the justification that they're using for 10 cubic yards. And so we just wanted to state our support of that and wanted to ensure that the commission didn't raise that level higher than 10 cubic yards. A lot of industry is requesting 100 cubic yards, which in our opinion is sufficiently not protective enough of public health, safety, and welfare.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are the only questions I have.
Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for coming in again today. This might be a really dumb question. I feel like I say that a lot, so I apologize. The request to have local governments included in the cleanup, it sounds to me like not just the timeline, but what the requirements are for cleanup. Could you explain to me what local governments currently have as far as the authority to be involved in a cleanup for a spill? And is it only COGCC that has that authority right now? And first part of the question. Second part of the question, how would you envision that partnership, or how would you envision the staff working with local government when it comes to a spill? And especially some of it might be kind of maybe an emergency situation. So I'm wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit for me.
Yeah, those are actually excellent questions. And I'll let Ms. Fitch address your first one, but I'll talk to your second one. We want to be involved in the determination of the implementation schedule and the reporting schedule, not so much the actual spill itself. And we take that from a perspective that we just want to know what's going on in our county. If that remediation is going to take 2 years, that's something the county would really like to be involved in determining that. Specifically, because if we know that there's planned development going on in that area, we would like to be aware, keep the commission aware that, well, there's a subdivision that's planned to go in there in the next year. So maybe there's something that can be done about speeding up this remediation, with the understanding that certain spills and remediation could take decades to clean up, and that's just the nature of spills and releases. But just having that dialogue between local governments and the commission is what's really important to us in the determination of the schedule, not so much what the commission deems is appropriate for the spill itself, whether it's installing monitoring wells or excavating certain depth down to clean soil or groundwater. That we would leave to the expertise of this commission and the CDPHE where applicable. And I'll let Ms. Fitch address the requirements for the county as it relates to spills in.
Commissioner McGowan, we do in our current standards that were adopted last year, we do have standards and the ability to impose penalties for spills and leaks. I think one of the big issues that the county has seen is those remediation projects, as Mr. Dean did say in his testimony, that have been going on for quite some time. I think the county would really like to have some updates on those and ability to have that that conversation with COGCC. So we do have separate authority, and we do inspect for spills. We have 2 inspectors at the county, but those regulations are very recent on the county's end, and that authority is very recent.
And we do have permits for excavation and remediation projects that we can require, conditional use to access property, inert fill if they're planning on bringing in soil from off-site. We require at the county that soil is tested clean before it's backfilled into a hole. We have requirements for fencing around open remediation sites. We have access and oversized load requirements for heavy equipment. We have noise requirements for heavy equipment, and then we can also require construction if they are building any temporary structure. We can require those types of permits as well. So again, knowing that's going to be going on for 2 years or 5 years or 6 months, knowing how that's going to relate to Adams County's regulations and own land use permit requirements. And then again, to my point earlier about land use planning, the county is growing very fast. And there's a lot of old vertical wells, especially in our I-25 and E-470 corridors. There's a lot of residential development going in. There's a lot of plugged and abandoned wells, or temporarily abandoned wells, or shut-in wells that will likely be plugged and abandoned once horizontal development starts. And so knowing that ahead of time when we get a development application in, it will help us in our internal review process for development applications.
Thank you.
Other questions for this panel? Okay, great. I'm not seeing any further questions. So thank you both again for your attendance and presentation and testimony, etc. It's always been helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now turn to Anthem Ranch, I believe.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Spees.
I'm glad to be here, Chair Robbins, commissioners, and staff. You know, I think this is probably going to be the last time I'm testifying before all of you, since we're moving towards the end goal here. I want to thank each of you and the interim commissioners and the staff for the ongoing work you are doing to try and address, based on science, the issues raised by the stakeholders in Senate Bill 19181. As you know, I'm a resident of Anthem Ranch and the vice president of the Anthem Ranch Community Association's Board of Directors. I'm also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, better known as AAAS, and I'm Chancellor Emerita from Penn State at the Berks campus in Reading, Pennsylvania. Anthem Ranch is an active 55+ community of 1,328 homes and roughly 2,751 residents. Regarding Rule 900, clearly many changes have been made since I submitted my pre-hearing statement, and we're very grateful for the staff's continued diligence in the process. There are, however, 3 specific rules under 903 that I'd like to address, and I realize that many of the individuals who spoke yesterday and you folks as well have addressed some of the same concerns, but they bear repeating. First one, 903B, paren 2. While modified somewhat, we want to make sure that when it says, quote, operators may request the director's approval to allow gas to escape into the air, end of quote, we want to make sure it's for a period not to exceed 48 hours. This is critically important if the wells in question are in residential areas. The demonstrated deleterious impacts of the gases being vented from a well are too significant to allow extended exposures to residents and the environment. During the flowback process phase, it's understandable that some of the gases coming up are not of a quality that we currently can use. And I say currently, we need to do some more investigation. How can we use this product coming up instead of venting it? But nonetheless, there has to be a way to use or dispose of the gases without venting and or flaring. Second, 903C1 cap C states, quote, if approved by the director on a gas capture plan pursuant to Rule 903E, gas vented or flared during the production, evaluation, or productivity test for a period, it goes on to say some other things, but not to exceed 60 days. End of quote. We really think that should be cut back significantly to 2 days before any drilling is allowed to generate products in Broomfield. Operators are required to have a pipeline system installed and operational. This should be a requirement across the state. By having the pipelines in place, there is no need for the excessive and extended venting or flaring. And the third one, 903D, D3 flies in the face of being good stewards of our land resources. And you just heard from Adams County, very well articulated, that currently operators can ask for an extension to exceed 12 months, or not to exceed 12 months. What's the point of drilling if you're going to vent everything or flare everything into the atmosphere? We need to capture those products. Operators have more than enough time to put in the gathering lines before they get to the point of doing some flaring and venting for extended periods of times. You know, while we believe that the old COGCC perspective on oil and gas resources forced a conflict between residents and operators and was not focused on health issues, there is one element of the old, and I really don't want to go back to the old ways of COGCC, but it was focused on not wasting natural resources. So each of these three mentioned recommended changes accomplishes two things. One, it prevents the wasting of our natural resources, and two, it minimizes the exposure of residents and our natural habitat inhabitants to serious toxic chemicals. And I want to thank you for all of the great work you do. You're almost done. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony this morning and for your testimony throughout this rulemaking. It has always been very helpful. Do we have questions? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Spees. I had one question just to clarify on your second point. I wanted to make sure that I got it right in my notes. Could you repeat what you were asking for with regards to the 60-day time frame for the venting and flaring during testing operations that I think you asked for a 2-day time frame. I just want to make sure I had that correct.
Yes, you are correct.
Thank you.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the testimony. I did have a question because again, I want to just clarify. You had a concern about 903D3.
Correct.
The 12-month allowance for existing wells or wells that would be in existence as of January 15th, 2021 to be able to have a 12-month window to be able to develop a gas capture system so that they would be able to continue to operate after that 12-month window when they would be required to not be to vent or flare as a part of regular production operations. So you do understand that that's only for existing wells, right? So that's not new wells. So a new well that applied wouldn't automatically get a 12-month window before they were required to.
But existing wells, if they're already existing, why on earth haven't they been working to put in capture lines?
No, I understand that. I just wanted to make that was clear. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Spees, I assume you would align with those parties that have also, sort of noted that since the publication of the straw dogs, sort of these existing wells have kind of been on notice that this is the direction that we're going. And so some of those parties have testified that, 12 months is over and beyond the 12 months since we published the straw dog, right?
Exactly. You've given so much notice to folks. What have they been doing for the last almost 12 months that we've been working on this whole process? So yes, I agree with you.
Other questions for this panel? All right, I'm not seeing any. Thank you again, and we appreciate your participation throughout these proceedings, and I believe that your participation has helped us get to a better place. So thank you very much.
Good luck in your completing the process.
Thank you very
You're
much.
almost home.
All right, I think we are now moving to the citizens groups presentation. And Ms. Larson, just correct me if I'm wrong with regard to whom I'm teeing up. You are the holder of the mantle.
Master list. Yes, and actually, Mr. Chair, we have Be the Change.
Yeah, I told you. Yep, there it is, be the change. Out of this.
And then we'll move on to the citizen groups.
Morning.
Good morning, Mr. Doe. We look forward to hearing from you.
We're probably the outlier here. We don't think you're pretty near done. We just think you're getting started. We've repeated over and over again that you really can't estimate the impacts of what you're allowing to be done by the oil and gas industry until you have a baseline. Yesterday, Ms. McGowan tried to start that conversation with water. She was cut short, I think. Let me reintroduce the conversation. A while back, we showed you that 3,000 plus wells this administration has approved since it took office last January would require between 24 billion and 33 billion gallons of water to be successfully drilled. We assume 8 to 11 million gallons per well. I want to start my timer here. By comparison, a Colorado citizen indoor use is about 17,000 gallons annually, basically for showers, toilets, etc. Thus, the oil industry's water demand to drill those 3,000 wells is enough water to satisfy the annual domestic needs of 1.4 million to 2 million Coloradans, about a third of the state population. Overall, the state has approved 30,000 horizontal wells. That comes to about 1 million acre feet of water. The state water plan is anticipating 400,000 acre feet needed by 2050. The cost of that water plan is $40 billion. And let me tell you, as an old water planner, that cost is lowballed. It'll probably be double that. So what we're doing here, what we need to ask ourselves, is this a rational plan? Is it rational for us to allow the oil and gas industry to take our most precious resource, which belongs to the public, incidentally, constitutionally, and use it for an enterprise that loses money? I mean, the total debt of this industry is $300 billion. That debt is greater than the GDP of 80% of the nations of this earth, and there are 190 of them. Think about that. Is this a rational process? And all this money and effort is being spent to prop up something that loses huge quantities of money. You've got to develop a baseline on water use. What is the impact of continuing to allow the oil industry to destroy our water? Because that's what it does. When these people that use 17,000 gallons use that water, most of it gets back into the system. It's treated and gets back into the hydrologic cycle. When these guys use it, we destroy it. And not only to destroy it, we destroy our groundwater by allowing them to inject it into our groundwater, which is heavy in TDS and salts. But it can be purified and used. It can't be purified after these guys dump their poisons into it, particularly the radioactive material. Which brings me to the second question, second issue for us, and that is radioactivity. Now, it was mentioned briefly yesterday that a new study out of Harvard shows that radioactive material is being transported airborne and can be measured and have a deleterious effect on people up to 30 miles from the fracking sites. Think about that. Now, one of our compatriots, Dr. Wendell Bradley, a PhD in physics, retired, wrote a letter to the COGCC a couple of years ago, perhaps 3 years ago, telling them that his analysis shows their procedures, their protocols for measuring T norms is inadequate and may underestimate the amount of radioactivity being introduced by 100 times. He never got a reply. We've confronted this issue before. Now you have Harvard telling you that it is real, and he is being vindicated. So your T-norm protocols are absolutely inadequate. They have to be changed. You cannot in good conscience allow this stuff to be airborne and affect people, because this is cumulative. Radiation is always cumulative. It gets in the lungs. It does, you don't expel it. It's there, and it grows and grows and grows. It's, as this study shows, it increases blood pressure, reduces lung capacity, and in long term may cause cancer. I would advise you, and we will probably develop an alternative proposal with the AQCC on this, but your protocols for T-norms are simply way off base, and they have to be changed. They simply have to be. So you've got a lot of work to do. You're barely getting started. And I will say again, as we've always said, you guys don't have the capacity to do the things that need to be done under 181. You simply don't have them. You need all the help you can get from the CDPHE, and it's not there as far as I can say. There was a lot of congratulatory work yesterday about how great you are cooperating, but you don't have the baselines you need, or either water, land, or air, and you've got a long way to go. I'm sorry, I wish it would, we'd like to congratulate you, but we just don't think it's, we can do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Doe. Are there questions for Mr. Doe? Seeing none, we'll move to the citizens groups.
Gee whiz.
Good morning. Are you able to see my screen?
We are able to see your screen, yes.
Great. Well, thank you, and good morning. Tom Delahanty, appearing on behalf of the citizen groups. Also here is my colleague Mike Freeman and our expert witness, Dr. David McCabe. Thank you to the COGC staff and to the commissioners for your hard work on the 900 series rules and for the opportunity to participate in this process. And we want to extend a particular thank you to staff for the major improvements on the venting and flaring requirements under Rule 903. Oops. There are 4 issues that I will be covering today. First, regarding pits, I'll discuss the need to install fencing and netting for existing pits, which is a common sense requirement that protects wildlife and livestock. And I'll also discuss the need to eliminate permitting of most new pits, because storing E&P waste in open pits is an outdated practice that's out of step with SB 181. I'll next discuss our support for Rule 904 with some small recommended improvements, and our support for Rule 903 before turning it over to Dr. McCabe. I'd first like to discuss pits. Overwhelmingly, pits are an outdated and unnecessary method for storing E&P waste. They emit VOCs and odors, they can leak and contaminate surface and groundwater, and they're dangerous to wildlife and livestock. Study after study has noted the environmental and health risks that pits pose, and a smattering of quotes from some of those studies is on the slide in front of you. The alternative to pits, closed hard-sided tanks, is a much better solution for fluid storage and management. Tanks are less likely to leak, and any leaks that do occur are easier to detect and remedy. Nor are liners a substitute for closed tanks. While staff's proposed rules requiring liners is an improvement over the existing rules, this measure is not enough. Liners can tear, and it's not always possible to detect tears at the bottom of the pit. In fact, BLM rejected an alternative in its 2015 hydraulic fracturing rule that would have allowed lined pits, because it recognized that lined pits are still inferior to hard-sided enclosed tanks. Additionally, Pits pose significant risks to wildlife and especially birds. As noted on the slide, one study estimated that up to 1 million birds per year die from open pits when they fall or land in them and become entrapped. Pits can also pose a threat to livestock and non-bird wildlife species. Extrapolating from the data in the study cited here, pits cause as many as 50,000 bird deaths per year in Colorado alone. And while the estimates provided in that 2006 study might be lower now as pits are used less, the point is that pits are devastating for birds. That same study also noted that the best solution to the problem is to eliminate pits altogether, but that if pits are going to be used, installing fencing and netting is critical. Recognizing that pits are an outdated and harmful method for dealing with E&P waste, other jurisdictions have taken the step of banning pits in most cases. California, North Dakota, and the Obama-era BLM all took that step. This approach by other jurisdictions illustrates that pits are not necessary and their harms are readily avoided by using tanks instead. Because prohibiting pits is a feasible approach that's necessary to protect wildlife, allowing pits, and especially allowing them without adequate fencing and netting, violates SB 181's mandate. In light of these concerns, we have 2 requests on pits. First, we encourage the Commission to retain staff's originally proposed language on fencing and netting, which would require these basic protections for existing pits. As the October 20th draft Statement of Basis and Purpose notes, pits pose a, quote, significant and ongoing risk to wildlife and especially birds. CPW concurred in that determination. The Statement of Basis and Purpose further notes that fencing and netting is a, quote, necessary and reasonable requirement. We agree, and this finding applies to existing pits in full force. Now, some operators have pushed back on the requirement to fence and net existing pits due to compliance costs, but compliance costs are not a valid basis for forgoing a necessary and reasonable protection. If there are circumstances where fencing and netting are not appropriate for a particular existing pit, then the burden should be on the operator to make that showing with approval by CPW. The exceptional cases should not swallow the rule here. Furthermore, operators' resistance to this requirement underscores the importance of our second request, to eliminate most new pits. If operators lack the resources to implement basic good housekeeping measures for existing pits, it raises the question whether they have adequate resources to responsibly construct and operate pits with new requirements like liners. At bottom, pits cause significant harm to wildlife, groundwater, and air, and these issues can all be easily avoided by using enclosed tanks instead. We'd also note that only 12 new pits have been permitted in the last 3 years, so we don't believe this request would have a real impact on operators. And as previously noted, other jurisdictions like North Dakota, California, and BLM have already taken this step, so our request is not groundbreaking, and we believe Colorado would be well served by following in these jurisdictions' footsteps. I'd quickly note that in response to a question from Commissioner McGowan yesterday, Mr. Giralmo discussed the need for pits when large volumes of water are at issue. But please note that we're not proposing the elimination of pits for centralized waste facilities, which typically handle these large volumes. And the red line shown here reflects that approach. We also have some red line language for fencing and netting, which is just the previously proposed language up until yesterday, and some language regarding percolation pits that I can discuss if the commissioners are interested. Moving on to our third issue, which is Rule 904. We support Rule 904, and we think that this is a good approach overall. We do have 2 small suggested refinements to ensure that wildlife and other resources are also considered in the cumulative impacts report. So first, when the director provides her annual report, excuse me, to the commission, we recommend that CPW be consulted in addition to APCD. And second, 905A5 should enumerate all of the resources identified in SB 181, which we think would help address wildlife and also leave space to address cumulative impacts to things like water resources, which Commissioner McGowan raised yesterday as well. Fourth and finally, we support draft Rule 903 and especially the prohibition on routine venting and flaring during production. And we urge the commission to adopt this rule. We do think that there's some additional refinements and clarifications that could further strengthen the rule, and I can take any questions on that if the commissioners desire. But for now, I will turn it over to our expert witness, Dr. David McCabe.
Good morning, and thank you, Tom. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about these important rules. My remarks will be about the limitations on flaring in Rule 903. Flaring is a wasteful practice that destroys resources, producing harmful pollution without utilizing the energy contained in the gas. Flaring is not necessary because, as I have described in my written testimony, operators have a number of ways to utilize or handle gas at wells, even when pipeline capacity is not available at the well. The availability of these options means that the proposed regulations will not cause significant disruption for operators. My written testimony describes several of these approaches outlined on this slide. I won't go into detail on them now, but I would be happy to answer questions about them. As we mention here in detail in our written submissions, 3 of these approaches are flexible and portable solutions, which are particularly valuable for giving operators options to handle gas. The remaining approaches are more useful for situations where gas is produced at a significant distance from pipelines that can transport it to market. We highlight these solutions to put the proposed regulations in context. The alternatives we describe for using or handling gas would not replace natural gas gathering, but they can give operators useful flexibility in situations where gas gathering via pipeline isn't economical or problems arise in getting pipes to well sites before a well is completed. In combination with proper gas capture planning, these options mean that operators will be able to comply with regulations curtailing routine flaring without major disruptions. I would like to turn now to issues concerning combustion of vapors from tanks. Using this slide from Mr. Duranlo's presentation yesterday, we understand that Rule 903 will cover the flares in the red circle towards the bottom. However, the emissions from burning tank vapors in ECDs at the top right are not covered. Flaring vapors from tanks is far better than venting those vapors, but it is still wasteful since it destroys tens of thousands of tons of useful hydrocarbons and produces vast amounts of harmful pollution. We suggest the Commission consider 2 issues regarding tank flaring. First, the definition of venting in the proposed rules does not include gas escaping from tanks, provided a properly sized separator is upstream of the tank. As staff explained yesterday, if the operator does not have adequate separation upstream of the tank, the escaping gas is subject to the limits on venting. We are concerned that there is no parallel language in the flaring definition. Burning gas from a storage tank is not defined as flaring, irrespective of whether the tank has sufficient upstream separation. Therefore, we are concerned that an operator could not hook a well up to a pipeline, route all the gas through the tank, combust all of that gas, and argue that it is complying with these rules because all of the combustion is excluded from the definition of flaring. We believe that this concern can be addressed simply by adding the language shown in red on this slide, which is modeled on the parallel clauses in the venting definition to the flaring definition. The second issue regarding flaring from tanks arises even when proper separation equipment is in place. We do not believe that this Commission should remain neutral on flaring of gas from tanks, because even if it comes from pollution control equipment, such flaring is harmful and wasteful. In fact, flaring of hydrocarbons from tanks is about as large a source of pollution in Colorado, or even larger, as flaring directly from oil wells. In the DJ Basin, for example, larger operators in EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program actually flare a lot more gas from tanks than from oil wells, as shown in this table. While the current definition of flaring excludes this practice from being defined as flaring, the harm done by the carbon dioxide from tank controls is just as real as the harm from flaring at oil wells, and as the data shows here, it is just as substantial. For years, some operators have used equipment that recovers tank vapors and injects them into gas gathering pipelines. EPA data shows that over 1,000 tanks in the DJ Basin are controlled this way, entirely avoiding the pollution from burning off vapors from these tanks. Products are on the market to facilitate this. Yet neither AQCC's Regulation 7 nor this Commission's rules require tank vapors to be captured rather than burned off, And in fact, neither set of rules even encourages capture. This commission should recognize the waste and harm caused by burning off tank vapors instead of capturing them. Recognizing this may require further deliberation even beyond this rulemaking, yet there are significant benefits from moving to a frame that requires operators to capture these hydrocarbons. This could start, for example, with defining the use of combustion to control emissions from new tanks as flaring. Thank you very much.
And that concludes our presentation for now. We will reserve the rest of our time for rebuttal, and we're open for questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your participation in today's presentation. Do commissioners have questions? Commissioner McGowan, then Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your time this morning. I'm wondering if you all heard the testimony from some folks who felt like the pits in Los Animas County in particular were useful to wildlife and as a water source, and what your response might be to that. And then also in regards to going to tanks and trying to address the sheer volume of water, is there sometimes a trade-off between, for example, truck traffic that would have to, again, continuously pick up large volumes of water from an enclosed tank, and what that trade-off is from an environmental perspective versus putting it into a pit, and if you have thoughts about that as well?
Sure, thank you for the question. I think on the first one, regarding the potentially beneficial use of water in Los Animas County, I think that if there are specific instances where it's appropriate to maybe allow access to a pit, then that is something that operators can basically make the case for. We do also have some data regarding, some of the TDS numbers for produced water in the state. And I think what it generally shows is that, especially for conventional wells, the quality of water is not such that it's really usable. And for things like coal bed methane production, where the produced water might be of slightly higher quality, like I say, there might be cases where operators can sort of make that showing. And really, I think that the same approach kind of applies to the second question as well, which is that again, I would say for first of all, for centralized facilities that typically do handle these large volumes of water, that's not something that we're not requesting that pits be eliminated for centralized facilities. And for other types of facilities, if there are specific circumstances, especially if there are situations where it would be environmentally beneficial to use a pit over a tank, Rule 502 provides that variance process, and that's always an option.
Mr. Delahunt, could I add a couple of remarks to supplement that?
Please.
So, Commissioner McGowan, first, with regard to your question about Los Animas County, Mr. Delahunt is exactly right that they could show that the pit is appropriate for wildlife use. But I also think it's important to note that our request to fence and net existing pits, as well as our proposal to require tanks instead of new pits, isn't inconsistent at all with the use of that water in places like Los Animas County. If the produced water coming out of CBM wells in certain places is good enough for livestock use, that can be done even while the pits are fenced and netted. It can be either piped in, either drawn off from the pit, or other ways derived to use the water for livestock or beneficial use. And the same is true for tanks. It doesn't mean that by managing this water in a protective way, it doesn't in any way foreclose using it for livestock watering or other purposes. And then with regard to the truck traffic question, this is one that the Federal Bureau of Land Management looked at when it was developing its 2015 fracking rule. And what they found is that even if there may be more truck traffic from using tanks, the benefits to wildlife and water quality outweigh any marginal impacts of air pollution and other impacts from truck traffic. And so on balance, BLM determined that the benefits from using tanks far outweighed any questions about truck impacts.
Yes, Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just for my own clarification, are you saying that you're still open to sorry, maybe you're not. You want everything netted and fenced, except are you open to someone applying for a variance and showing the commission that it might not be necessary to do those things from a wildlife or a protective perspective, environmental perspective?
That's right. And we would also note that in the language that was originally proposed under Rule 909F, I mean, that allowed for CPW to basically weigh in instances where fencing and netting might not be necessary. And that to us seems like a really appropriate approach, where basically the default rule is that fencing and netting is required, including for existing pits. But if CPW makes a determination that fencing and netting for whatever reason might not be necessary, then that's something that operators can get and can bring back to the commission.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Other questions? Commissioner Nanjava?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I really appreciated some of the additional discussion on different options, you know, apart from flaring and venting. One question I had though before that is on your suggestion for 904 of including CPW in 904A along with the APCD. And I'm guessing you also noted that that CPW was added in B, and so I'm just curious if you feel that the addition to A is necessary with B being in place. Does it add value, and if you could kind of just explain that a little bit more to me in terms of why you feel that addition is necessary there.
Mr. Delahunty?
Mr. Delahunty, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mr. Freeman, that's fine.
Okay, sure. I mean, we did note that it was in B. Our thinking with regard to A is that it would still be useful to include CPW in assessment, not only of doing the studies, but also in determining what studies ought to be done. You know, we think the existing language is good and certainly broad enough to cover that. We just suggested that as a clarifying measure.
Thank you. And so then obviously the subparts there under A are more specifically geared towards APCD and air quality, et cetera. Would you offer additional language there to cover the wildlife related matters if that is what you're trying to get covered there as well? Or do you feel that the language is sufficient with the with just the mention of CPW in Part A? So
our thinking is that with subpart A, you know, it references not just the 2 through 5 that would talk about media that are APCD related, but that the CIDR data does include wildlife. And so our thought would be it would be useful to make sure that the annual recommendation from the director should encompass or at least consider wildlife cumulative impacts as well as air quality and climate impacts.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Freeman. And I have one other follow-up or additional question, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So with the additional options related to flaring, as you noted in the slide, you know, the flaring from tanks is regulated by AQCC. And am I correct in understanding that what you're saying though is that the cumulative amounts of flaring from tanks are greater than or perhaps can have the same impact as flaring of the gas from the flaring from the gas from the gas flare? I'm using the incorrect terminology, but you know what I'm saying? In the diagram, there was the flares that were occurring from the tanks, and then there was the flare stack that was, you know, specific to the gas flaring. So I'm just asking, are you saying that the flaring from the gas lines is more impactful? Sorry, the flaring from the tanks can be more impactful than what is directed to the gas flare stack?
I'll go ahead and answer that,
Mr.
Mike
McKay.
and Tom. Okay. Yes, Commissioner, they're similar in magnitude, in volume. And the reason I've equivocated and not saying which one is bigger is because the data is not perfect. The data I showed is from EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. And the large issue with that is that smaller operators simply don't report data to that program. So we don't have data from all tanks and all tank flares or all gas line flares included, which is why I've used kind of loose language. But the data I showed was just for the Denver-Julesburg basin. In that basin, flaring from tanks is considerably larger than flaring from oil wells or flaring from separators, you might call it. In other basins, the pattern is somewhat different. Statewide, they're of the same order of magnitude.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McCabe. One last follow-up there is, you mentioned that neither the AQCC regulation number 7 or our rules at COGCC require capture from tank emissions. Is that capture process, has that been done in other places? Are there examples of that? And is that technology readily available?
Yes. So in the Denver-Julesburg basin, operators report about 1,000 vapor recovery systems, which take those vapors and inject them into gathering lines. Nationwide, there are over 10,000 of these systems reported to EPA.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate the information.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess this question is for Dr. McCabe. I'm curious as if you know why flaring in the DJ Basin from tanks is in greater volumes than the flaring that occurs from the flare stack from the wellhead or the separator.
I would simply say that the DJ is a big mature basin with a fairly well-developed gathering system. And I guess I don't think I can answer the question precisely, but I can say that there has been simply, even well before these rules were proposed, there's simply been more scrutiny of flaring what I'm referring to as associated gas off the top of the separator. Flaring the gas off the top of the tank is regarded as an emission control and hasn't received the scrutiny that flaring from the separator has.
Thank you for that. I'm curious about the comment you made about the potential for operators intentionally bypassing separators, sending all of their gas into the tanks and flaring them from the tanks under the AQCC standards and authority. And I'm curious, is this a current practice that you're aware of in Colorado? And I guess with what frequency are operators doing this?
Mr. McCabe?
I'm not aware of data on that, sir. I think there certainly is, that setup is not uncommon to my knowledge, where you simply don't have a separator and gas is sent to a tank and then the gas off the top of the tank is flared. I don't know how common that is in Colorado versus in other basins.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Dr. McCabe, go ahead.
Well, I believe the answer is the frequency of that setup versus other setups versus having a separator really depends on the gas to oil ratio and the production level and things like that. I will say simply that our concern arose from the noting what we think is a very wise provision in the venting definition, and then noticing that there wasn't a parallel provision in the flaring definition.
Thank you, Dr. McCabe.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the testimony. I'm going to follow up a little bit on some other questions that were asked by commissioners. And maybe ask a question also to Commissioner Putnam, but regarding this, the interaction between the AQCC and Regulation 7 versus the COGCC and the the diagram that Mr. Duranlo had presented yesterday. And I still think I'm a little gray, a little confused as far as that interaction. I know that there was some communication and attempts to attempt not to duplicate as much as possible the regulations and between the AQCC and the COGCC. It was also clearly indicated by AAG Minor that both the COGCC and the AQCC have regulatory authority should they choose to utilize it. But I guess if someone could answer the question about the regulatory process for Regulation 7 with the AQCC, particularly around the flaring of gases from tanks, and this concern that seems to be presented that potentially tanks could be utilized as a separator, as a bypass to these COGCC flaring regulations. Did that make any sense?
Mr. Chair, I can at least start to address Commissioner Messner's question.
Yes, Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Messner. And I think if Mr. Duranlo and if Ms. Willie is on the line, they may be able to add in. So I'll say, I think this is the first that I've heard about the concern of kind of bypassing gas that would otherwise be addressed to the separator and sending it through the tanks. I think there are a number of safety and environmental issues that would be associated with doing that. So would probably need some additional feedback from staff to understand whether that's allowable or certainly likely. If someone were to change the way that they're permitting or changing the way they're operating those tanks, it would likely result in a violation of existing permits, which are not based on routing a lot of that gas through those tanks. And they would need to seek amendments to those permits or would be out of compliance. Certainly, if that's something that they were planning to do on the front end, you would see much larger emissions numbers, through the permitting there that I think would flag staff that something was going on there. And then they certainly need to pay fees to us based on those emissions. So, I think it's something we should look at, and it certainly wouldn't want us to encourage that practice. I'm not sure practically how large a concern that is, but interested in Mr. Duranlo or Ms. Willie's perspective if they're available.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yeah, AAG Minor.
I believe that Ms. Willie is joining the Zoom now. She was not here to hear the question, so she may need a refresher. Mr. Duranlo is here as a panelist, but unfortunately I think is not currently available. I think Mr. Leonard or Ms. Byrne could also speak to the question. I will just briefly state that COGCC staff are aware that operators do occasionally sort of use a tank as a separator when there's not separation equipment on site. and that sometimes the sizing of the separation equipment does result in natural gas produced from the well, as Dr. McCabe said, associated gas being routed to a tank. And that is why those categories of natural gas are excluded from the exclusion of gas from a tank that would be venting. So that this is an issue that staff is certainly aware of and was attempting to address with the definitions. So I don't know if we now have perhaps Mr. Leonard or other staff who could speak more directly to the question.
Mr. Leonard?
Thank you. I can speak to part of that. One of the concerns becomes, as an example, if an operator loses their gathering capacity, and then they may still be sending that gas through the separator, but it's not routed to that gathering line, but routed directly to the storage tank through their equipment. Therefore, there's no real separation of the gas, if that helps.
Are there others from staff that want to take a crack at this? Director Murphy?
And Mr. Leonard as well, I wonder, that would be an upset condition though, right? I mean, that.
Well, possibly. I don't know of any specific examples that I'd want to state right now, but there's, there is that long-term probability or possibility that the gathering you've lost all your gathering. So to continue producing, you're putting it through the tank, even, maybe even a smaller volume of gas, and then it's going to the ECDs beyond the tank. Or if no ECDs, then it's just being vented.
Okay. So, Mr. Chair, if I could ask a couple other questions.
Yeah. Mr. Messner.
So one of the other things that was brought up was this concern about the language around the netting and the default that it must be netted, in all circumstances with a variance exception to be allowed. I guess are you uncomfortable with the language as it is that says operators will fence and net or install CPW approved exclusion devices on all new and existing pits pursuant to Rule 1202A4 unless waived by CPW pursuant to Rule 1202A? And it seems like that's saying what you want, and that's the current language. And so I guess I'm just confirming that that's appropriate to you.
So our read of the current language is that the clause "and existing" was struck from those rules. That was the change that was made yesterday, and so that's really the concern that we're getting at.
Okay. Did we strike "and existing" yesterday? Okay, so I didn't get that written down in my draft rules, so I appreciate that. And then I'm certainly curious, Mr. McCabe, about the different utilizations of gas, and in situations where there may or may not be gathering systems, and some of them that you're talking about are combusting and utilization for electricity or reinjection into appropriate formations. I've got a little bit of experience with coal mine methane, looking at different ways to utilize methane being produced as a waste product from coal mining and generating it into electricity. But what I at least found with that research is that it was not feasible economically to be able to do that because of the ultimate cost of the kilowatt hour of generated electricity versus what the base load is from the different utility providers. Are you seeing something different with natural gas being produced from these more conventional gas wells, or is it a kind of a similar challenge with the economics of it.
The economics, thank you. The economics certainly vary, Commissioner. And I don't think we are claiming that these are always profitable. But we believe that it's important to put out there that operators have those other options, and so that they're considered even if they have a net cost.
Okay. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Other questions for this panel? All right, I'm not seeing further questions. We thank this panel for their continued participation with us in our rulemaking. I believe we will try to tackle one more panel before we take our morning break, and that is Citizens for a Healthy Community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, commissioners. Can you see me and hear me?
We can.
Wonderful. Before I start, I just want to make sure that Mark Waltemeyer and Chris Michalski are up.
It looks like you have both of them.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, good morning again, commissioners. It's nice to see you. I want to thank staff and the commission for all the work on the 900 series. I'm Natasha Leger, Executive Director of Citizens for a Healthy Community. And we do have recommendations for strengthening the rules, specifically around notice for spills and releases. And this morning, we'll start out with Mark Waltemeyer, owner of Thistle Whistle Farm in the North Fork Valley, and then move on to Chris Michalski, counsel for CHC. So if we can move on to Mark.
I'm here.
Wonderful.
My name is Mark Waltemeyer, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I farm in the North Fork Valley and serve on the board of the Valley Organic Growers Association, VOGA, which includes 135 agricultural producers in the North Fork Valley. VOGA members grow vegetables, fruit, livestock, wine, grapes, grain, and dairy products, and we have a growing agritourism industry that complements our food production. The North Fork Valley is known throughout the state as a premier source of high-quality food. Many of us who farm in the North Fork feel particularly vulnerable to the consequences of upstream gas and oil development, and we want to encourage you to continue to include our concerns in your rulemaking process. Our irrigation water comes through areas where oil and gas activity now occurs and areas where oil and gas activity is slated to occur. Access to these areas is along a narrow, winding two-lane road subject to slumps and rock falls, a highway that also runs through our communities and alongside our river, Paonia Reservoir, an irrigation reservoir that provides water to a large portion of the valley's farms, and our irrigation ditches. The river runs below the highway the entire way. We are concerned about accidents and spills from trucking on this route. My farm's water comes from the North Fork of the Gunnison, diverted into a ditch that parallels the highway for nearly 10 miles from Paonia to above my farm. My water starts in areas leased for oil and gas and follows a transportation path for oil and gas related trucking. Our concern is that we live and grow food downstream of oil and gas activity, most of which occurs in a neighboring county, Gunnison County. While Gunnison County maintains performance-based regulations to protect the air, water, and environment, Delta County has repealed its oil and gas regulations. We have little say in what goes on upstream of us and are not actively included in the release of information of spills and other incidents when they occur. We're also not informed about applications and other activities that will affect our roads and traffic and will potentially affect our water and air. A lack of accurate, timely information leads to distrust of the industry and industry regulation from those of us downstream. I'm asking today for you to address the importance of timely notification of incidents, spills, and releases that occur in the watershed above me and the extent of their effects. I've been asking for nearly 2 years for the COGCC to implement an opt-in notification procedure that enables farmers and water rights holders like me to sign on to be notified directly when something upstream of us occurs so we can make contingency plans if necessary. Past incidents have made it into your website, but we find that inadequate. We need to be promptly and directly notified of spills and their risks. Additionally, rules need to be implemented to notify us of applications, injection wells, and other activities that concern us. 12 spills in our watershed have occurred in the last 3 years. We were not notified directly of any of them in a timely manner. 2 of the spills from May and September of 2019 remain unresolved, but we are told there is nothing for us to worry about. The incidents to date have been small, but we worry about the cumulative impact of low-dose chemical releases. Research has shown that exposure to fracking chemicals in small doses over long periods of time is harmful to human and animal health. Timely information and an openness to questions and concerns would go a long way to building trust between residents here and your agency. I'm advocating for changes in your policies, procedures, and rules that allow for better and quicker information, with the onus on the dissemination of the information on the oil and gas producer and the regulator, not on the affected citizenry. My livelihood depends on clean water and air, and on the valley's reputation for clean water and clean air. Threats to our water and air are threats to our livelihoods, and threats to our reputation equally threatens our livelihoods. While the industry may not think a spill is material, we and our customers think differently because they buy from us trusting that the food we grow is healthy and uncontaminated. We have had to rely on watchdog groups in the Valley to monitor the COGCC website, groups who themselves have limited resources, and we find the system of monitoring oil and gas activity inadequate. As development increases, we expect more spills and accidents to occur, and we need policies in place that will allow us to react in time to protect our land and crops. Revising your reporting and notification procedures will get us closer to that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for that. And I believe we have some slides to pull up.
Yeah, let me go ahead and share screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Wonderful.
All right. Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Mark. Hello, Commissioners. Again, my name is Chris Michalski, and I'm an attorney in Gunnison, and I serve as legal counsel for Citizens for a Healthy Community. CHC thanks staff for the hard work done on the 900 series to align the rules with SB 181, and CHC fully endorses broad documenting and reporting requirements for spills and releases. Specifically, CHC urges staff and the Commission to adopt Rule 912A2 as written. Rule 912A2 requires operators to investigate, clean up, and document impacts resulting from all spills and releases. Certain groups have argued that Rule 912A2 is too arduous because it requires documentation of all spills and releases, no matter the size. As CHC pointed out in its response statement, if an operator wants to avoid documenting spills and releases, it should avoid spilling or releasing in the first place. Further, Rule 912A2 addresses the fact that small spills and releases over time may have a greater cumulative impact and creates transparency into an operator's operation. As such, CHC supports that rule as written. Next, CHC supports Rule 912A3 as written. That rule gives the director authority to perform any action to prevent adverse impacts caused by spills or releases. Rule 912A3 provides a necessary backstop so that the director can take rapid action when an adverse impact to public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife is created by a spill or a release. CHC opposes any limitation on director discretion to require an operator to prevent adverse impacts caused by a spill or a release. Finally, CHC wants to once again address notice from the general email notification list. Despite staff and the Commission repeatedly stating that the general email notification list extends beyond hearings in the 500 series, the rules do not reflect that. That is, the general email notification list is only for hearings. It is not for applications, it is not for underground injection, and it is not for spills or releases. To be clear, the language in 504A3 is broad, which leads staff and the Commission to believe that it applies beyond hearings. But the language is limited to the hearing section, which therefore means that the general email notification list only provides very limited notice for hearings. In the North Fork Valley, water rights holders, like Mark, have complained to the COGCC on several occasions regarding not receiving notice of spills in their watershed. They have expressed how important it is for them in managing their brand and operations to have timely notice of any spills in their watershed. You just heard Mark echo that same sentiment. While the COGCC must notify the LGD of spills and releases, there is no obligation on the part of the LGD to notify the public. In the case of water rights holders in the North Fork Valley, they have never been notified by the Delta County or Gunnison County LGD of spills. More importantly, operators seem to believe it is only their perception of adverse impacts that matters, and that if a water rights holder has not been notified, that there is nothing for them to worry about. That is simply an operator-centric view of the impact of spills and releases. CHC urges staff to extend the general email notification list to spills and releases in the 900 series by adding a section 912B12 stating as follows. Upon receipt of a Form 19, the Commission will give notice to any person who has filed a request to be placed on the Commission's general email notification list. Notice by publication or notice provided pursuant to the Commission's general email list does not confer interested party status on any person. As a conforming edit to acknowledge the unintended limitation of Rule 504A3, CHE urges the Commission to extend the general email notification list to applications in the 300 series and underground injection applications in the 800 series. It is critical that the public receive notice of spills and releases so as to be informed of harmful impacts in the state and in their backyard. It is equally as important that the public have the ability to receive notice for oil and gas and underground injection applications so that they may participate in the process from the beginning. We recognize that staff is challenged by limited IT and GIS resources. However, the sign-up for the general email notification list should not be overly burdensome. Simply, the sign-up form can have checkboxes so the public can check what they want to be notified of. Some people may only want to be notified of spills and releases, while other people may want to be notified of every oil and gas activity, from applications to hearings. We see this as a first step to moving towards more geographically specific notice. So to conclude, the public, like Mark, cannot rely on the general email notification list as written in Rule 504A3 because it is extremely narrow and only provides notice for hearings. If the Commission staff truly intend for Rule 504A3 to extend to notice of permit applications, underground injection wells, and spills and releases, then it must make conforming edits in the 900, 800, and 300 series as suggested. Thank you.
Thank you. Does that conclude your presentation?
Yes, it does.
Very good. Thank you. Do we have questions? Commissioner Messner.
I just have a quick question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, I appreciate the testimony. And Mr. Waltemir, you and I have chatted about this in the past as well. And so it's certainly something that is on my mind. But I'm trying to understand the lay of the land a little bit. How far is your operations from the nearest oil and gas operation?
The nearest oil and gas operation is above Paonia Reservoir, which would be, Paonia Reservoir is about 24 miles from us, and it's just above there, so a little over 24 miles.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
How many oil and gas locations potentially impact the irrigation water?
I can go ahead and answer that. So right now we don't have a number of wells as in Garfield County or on the Front Range. In Gunnison County, at any point in time, you have between 50 and 60 active wells. In Delta County, you have between 2 and 4 active wells. The real issue is that we have a resource management plan by the BLM that was just recently approved that could foresee up to 1,200 wells in the Upper North Fork Valley. And that's our big concern, is the potential for expansive growth.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Other questions from commissioners? Okay, well, thank you for your presentation this morning. Thank you for your continued participation with us. We do appreciate it. Glad to see that Zoom meetings allow for folks to attend from all elements of the state in a little better capacity. So we will Zoom you away, and I believe it's time for our morning break. We will take a 15-minute break and reconvene at 11:05. To everyone, this is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission October 27th hearing. We are rolling through stakeholder presentations on the 900 series. We just finished up with Citizens for a Healthy Community, and I believe Colorado Rising has a 5-minute presentation at this point. So we would invite them to the panel. Good morning, Mr. Salazar. We cannot hear you for some reason. You appear to be unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you now.
You can hear me now. Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Good morning. It's good to see you, commissioners. I appreciate the opportunity to present to you today. I agree with Mr. Doe from Be the Change that I don't believe you're almost done. Much of what has happened through these rulemakings will require implementation by your hearing officers, the compliance of oil and gas operators, and decisions by the commission related to your final rules. But I sincerely appreciate the fact that you have gone through these very many months of rulemaking, and you are here today, nearing the end of at least the rulemaking. But I remain optimistic that community groups and environmental protection organizations will ensure that the protections evident in Senate Bill 19-181 will cause all things to bend to public health, safety, welfare, environment, and wildlife resources. The issue of venting and flaring obviously are contentious issues. For Colorado Rising, we have had problems with hearing officers not allowing us to gather data from the oil and gas industry on venting and flaring. Despite protestants having a statutory right to explore issues of waste and correlative rights, our request for this data has been consistently denied. Thus, the rulemaking is important, if only to clarify the rules and to provide guidance to the parties and to the hearing officers. As we all know, state law prohibits the escape, blowing, or releasing directly or indirectly into the open air of gas from wells productive of gas only, or gas in an excess or unreasonable amount from wells producing oil, or that unreasonably diminishes the quantity of oil or gas that ultimately may be produced. It's a long way of saying, hey, we're not going to vent or flare, right? That's the public policy of the state that, that venting and flaring just shouldn't happen. Now, combine this prohibition with your fiduciary duty as a commission regarding severance tax. As you know, our severance tax statute makes it a public policy of this state to recapture a portion of the lost wealth of our natural resources taken by the oil and gas industry. So when I take a look at your venting and flaring rules and weigh them with your statutory and fiduciary obligations, I'm wondering why the most restrictive rules and regulations are not being implemented with respect to venting and flaring. Truly, there should be a stated prohibition to venting and flaring in all cases with very few exceptions. The draft rules are just too broad. The draft rules seem to assume that venting and flaring is just going to happen. Why does the commission so easily accept that premise? It is your statutory obligation not to accept the premise. Allowing for venting and flaring doesn't just harm the mineral owner, but it also fiscally harms the state. I mean, otherwise, why would you have a statute that talks about correlative rights if the very operator who is taking the mineral rights away from mineral owners in the state is just flaring it out into the atmosphere? If only for the public welfare component of public health, safety, welfare, environment, and wildlife resources, the commission is statutorily required, at least in a couple of statutes, to ensure that venting and flaring does not occur. But if you can't get beyond the old regime thinking about venting and flaring, at the very least, the commission should consider adding language that requires oil and gas operators to compensate mineral owners and the state for the waste associated with venting and flaring. Environmental Defense Fund provides an excellent analysis of the waste through venting and flaring in the state of Colorado in their pre-hearing statement. So that's the welfare aspect of public health, safety, and welfare, environment, and natural resources, wildlife resources portion of Senate Bill 181. So let's get to the other parts of it, which is public health and safety, as well as environmental resources, or in the environment and wildlife resources. So as we all know, just before the snowstorm hit, Colorado suffered the most devastating wildfires in our state's history. As a matter of fact, I just got a notice on my phone, as maybe you did, that these wildfires still are not over with. Despite the fact that 10 inches of snow have fallen in some places, these wildfires are still going. We're also in a state drought. Climate scientists are damn near universal in saying that fossil fuel extraction is heavily responsible. One would really have to be the most obtuse and or compromised individual to believe that venting and flaring doesn't contribute to this. So in combination with your fiduciary responsibilities, public health, safety, and environmental issues necessitates the most restrictive regulations on venting and flaring. Commissioners, I'm not going to reiterate the massive scientific studies related to the harm venting and flaring has on our environment and on our public. We have it in our pre-hearing statements. Other groups have it in their pre-hearing statements. Once again, I turn to EDF's pre-hearing statement for good information. But the bottom line is that you know these gases are harmful, and you know that much of what is vented and flared adversely affects our environment. For the 900 series language to be in compliance with Senate Bill 19181, the 900 series rules must have a stated prohibition to venting and flaring in all levels of oil and gas operations, not only in some or in other places, but in all levels of oil and gas operations. And must require oil and gas operators who cannot or will not comply to compensate mineral owners in the state for the waste associated with venting and flaring. So Colorado Rising adopts and supports EDF's position on this matter. With respect to cumulative impacts, I suppose we'll just have to see how the hearing officers, the parties, the commission, and the AQCC deal with this issue. Thus, this matter likely will be a subject of litigation and debate as we move forward. I'm hoping that that's not the case. I'm hoping that we're able to find a good landing spot when it comes to cumulative impacts. But based off of the direction that the rules are going right now, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out on the ground through these hearings as we move forward. I appreciate your time and attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Salazar. Appreciate your participation and presentation. Do we have questions? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Salazar, for the testimony. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand the concern. I mean, I understand the concern, but I'm trying to come up with the solution, I guess. So currently in the rules, it says, after commencement of production operations at oil and gas locations, venting or flaring of natural gas produced from any completed well is prohibited, except under the following circumstances. There's a limited number of circumstances that for the most part are either emergencies or maintenance. Are you looking for additional or more limited exceptions, or what's the ask there?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. I would point out that even before you get to that point, if you take a look at 903B, 903C, before you actually get to emissions during production, there is no prohibition. There's an assumption that there might be some emissions during drilling operations, presumption that there's emissions during completion operations, and then we finally get to emissions during production, and then it says is prohibited except under the following circumstances. Now those following circumstances, 1A through, F, that's basically the entire production, right? I mean, what we're seeing play out in Broomfield, for example, or in other places, is that this prohibition, the exception and the prohibition is all of this, right? So what are you really prohibiting? I guess that's the question. What are you really prohibiting if you have all these exceptions? I'll tell you what ends up happening because of these exceptions is that we have a waste that has fiduciary implications upon the mineral owner and upon the state. And then there's no actual penalty for it for the oil and gas operator, right? So they fall under all these exceptions and they're able to vent and flare and do whatever they want during this emissions during production. And then there's no consequence for it. And I guess that's the problem that I think a lot of people are stating in the testimony. I've been listening to the testimony, is that this is too broad, number one, and then number two, there's no consequence. And so what I think that you need to do is you need to narrow these exceptions. I don't think that that there should be gas flared or vented during an upset condition. We don't even know what that means. Anything can be an upset condition. We know that oil and gas operators will argue 6 ways to sundown what upset conditions means, right? And it's not really defined in the statute. So anything can be an upset condition. Gas vented during a part of active or required maintenance and repair activity, including pipeline plugging. Okay, so that might be an area there where, you know, the technology allows them to capture that gas instead of venting or flaring it during a repair activity. We see that happening in multiple types of other industries where they're able to capture certain things while they repair another issue, right? So, but this just leaves it wide open. They could say, hey, I was repairing something. I actually took out a wrench and I tightened a screw while we were venting and flaring, but it meets the exception, right? Or maybe something not as innocuous as just getting a wrench and tightening a screw. Maybe it's something a little bit bigger, but that should not have resulted in venting or flaring anyway, because that part of the production had nothing to do with venting and flaring, right? So your rules are just wide open. I could drive a Mack truck through these rules if I wanted to, and the oil and gas industry will, right? If approved by the director on the oil and gas capture plan. Okay, so that's a different matter where you know, the director will actually have to take a look at this and say, yes, venting and flaring is going to be acceptable. Gas vented during a Braden test. Okay, well, you know, maybe that's something that you know, would be difficult to stop any type of venting or flaring. So I can understand that, right? Well liquids unloading, as well as well liquids unloading employs best management practices, right? What in the world does that mean? Well liquids unloading, and what scenario does that apply to? I can imagine that they'll argue all sorts of things in terms of well liquids unloading. So I guess the bottom line is that these rules, these exceptions, outside of your prohibition, these exceptions under emissions during production is basically everything. And they can argue that these rules are so ill-defined that everything will apply that will allow for venting and flaring. And that's a problem.
Okay, I appreciate your opinion on that. I don't agree with you because I do think that there's some pretty limited exceptions, and I'm always open to hearing suggestions on specific language to tighten it up. And, you know, having read these and evaluated, it's not as broad as perhaps you're making it out to be, but I appreciate your concern and certainly we'll look into it.
So I appreciate that, Commissioner Messner. I will say though that venting and flaring, this is a habit, it's a routine, it's a practice of the oil and gas industry in the state of Colorado. This past weekend alone, there were pictures that were taken by people up in the Weld County area where a major venting and flaring issue was happening, right? We see it all the time. I've taken pictures myself. I've seen it happening myself, driving from Greeley and back to Thornton along the 285 corridor, I'm sorry, 85 corridor. And I've seen it, right? We should not be surprised that this is happening. If it is going to happen, if you're going to have these exceptions on here, then the correlative rights part of the statute, as well as public welfare part of the statute, as well as the severance tax part of the statute, that needs to be enforced. Oil and gas operators should not be given carte blanche to vent and flare under these exceptions without compensating those individuals for the loss of that product. And there's nowhere in any rules that I've seen that causes oil and gas operators to do that. Statute trumps the rule. So if we're talking about public welfare and we're talking about severance taxes, which is a statute, then you should at least have in your rules something that compensates those mineral owners and the state for that loss, because it is a waste.
Thank you, Mr. Salazar, for answering Commissioner Messner's questions. Do we have other questions? All right, seeing none, we thank you for your participation.
Have a blessed.
We will now bring Western Resource Advocates to the panel. See, we have Ms. Walker. Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to see you again. Also need Stacy Tellinghausen, our expert, please.
Okay, we're working on that. Okay, we have your expert and we have you. We can see and hear you and we can see your screen.
Okay, Stacy, take it away.
All right, thank you. Good morning, commissioners. My name is Stacy Tellinghausen. I'm a senior climate policy analyst for Western Resource Advocates. First today, I wanted to recognize the work of this commission throughout this mission change rulemaking to wrestle with the challenge of how to address the oil and gas industry's impact on climate change, as well as their impact on public health and the environment. Thank you for your continued attention to this issue. I think broadly, we are in a really difficult position. We have a very limited amount of time to make deep reductions in our emissions in order to avoid the most devastating impacts of climate change. That's clear from the science, but also clear from all of our experience on the ground. You know, at least over the past week, particularly as many of us watched as the East Troublesome Fire exploded overnight and impacted numerous communities on both sides of the divide. The urgency and the magnitude of this challenge just underscore the importance of developing rules that address the emissions from Colorado's oil and gas industry. In my comments today, I'll address the most recent revisions to Rule 904, which WRA supports, and provide some suggested additions to the rule language. I'll also discuss the most recent developments at the AQCC and how this commission should consider those developments. So first, WRA supports the new provisions in Rule 904. The new Rule 904 provisions direct the director to develop an annual report in coordination with the Air Pollution Control Division that summarizes the industry's cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, among other things. I believe this report will provide the commission with really important information on a timely basis, and I believe it's a significant improvement from the initial draft of Rule 904. In particular, the commission will have annual up-to-date information on the oil and gas industry's greenhouse gas emissions, and will be able to compare that information with the intended emission trends identified in the roadmap. I think this report also ensures that the commission regularly evaluates whether additional rulemakings are necessary to meet the greenhouse gas targets or to address any other cumulative impacts. So I recommend the commission adopt this new rule language, but also consider several amendments, which I'll walk through now. WRA suggests 3 amendments to the rule language in Part 904A. First, we recommend a minor clarification to the language in Part 904A2. This is really to clarify that while the greenhouse gas roadmap is currently the clearest path for how Colorado expects to meet its greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, it is possible, and I think even likely, that the Air Division or the Energy Office will develop subsequent plans, particularly as rules are developed, as new technology emerges, and as we see the progress that we're making. Therefore, I think we are suggesting making the language a little bit broader to include the greenhouse gas roadmap and any subsequent initiatives by the Air Division or AQCC to achieve Colorado's emission reduction goals. And you can see that language on the screen here. The second amendment to Rule 904A that we would recommend is to change it or amend it to be more explicit that the director's report will actually calculate the industry's total expected emissions from the sources of data identified earlier in parts 1 and 3 of this section of the rule, and compare those emissions with the targets laid out by the roadmap or subsequent plans. In our recommended rule part 4, the language we suggest would clarify that this is one intent of the annual report. It would also direct the director to provide any recommendations to the commission regarding these emission trends and how the commission should consider them in the upcoming year. The third suggestion we have for Rule 904A is that we recommend including a Part 5 as part of that, a requirement that the director's annual report include a summary of the technologies or actions that are above and beyond regulatory requirements that the industry maybe has adopted over the past year or could adopt to reduce or address cumulative impacts. You know, the type of measures that could be included in that are really varied, but it could include new control technologies, efforts to reduce emissions from inactive wells, or efforts to electrify processes. We think this is valuable information for the commission and industry to have on a regular basis on the types of emission control measures that are being employed by others in the industry, in part because I think that could lead to more widespread adoption of such measures. And finally, WRA recommends the commission add a new rule, Part 904B, to be really explicit about how the commission will use all of the information in this report. The information in the report will be really valuable, but only if it's used to inform policy. One important and valuable application of the information in the report will be to identify the need for any additional rulemakings, and we absolutely support that provision of 904A. But I believe the commission can also put this information in the report to an even and more important application by using it as part of the commission's evaluation of new oil and gas permits. A basic addition to the rule, such as the proposed language shown here, would increase the impact and the value of the report significantly. Again, I want to emphasize WRA's support for the new rule language in Part 904 and ask the Commission to consider the amendments to the rule in Section 904A and the additional rule language in 904B that I've talked through here. And finally, today, I want to just address the most recent developments at the Air Quality Control Commission. As I described in my written testimony, the Governor's Greenhouse Gas Roadmap was released in late September and outlines even more stringent emission reductions in this industry than were contemplated in earlier drafts. It recommends a 33% reduction by 2025 and 50% by 2030. These are really ambitious reductions. The roadmap and the Air Division in a separate analysis state that these deep reductions are essential for Colorado to achieve our overall emission goals. You know, quite frankly, it's difficult to turn over technology fast enough in the transportation and building sectors to achieve our goals in a cost-effective way, which is why the state is prioritizing actions in the electricity and the oil and gas sectors. The Air Division has also initiated a stakeholder process to develop new rules to reduce emissions in the oil and gas industry. These rules will likely be considered next fall. And while the AQCC moves forward with these rules, I think it's reasonable and in fact desirable for the COGCC to put forward and adopt complementary rules. I think this is wholly consistent with the administration's approach to develop parallel and complementary strategies among different state agencies rather than relying entirely on the AQCC. WRA's proposed rule language in Part 904B would direct the COGCC to evaluate new permits in light of the industry's overall greenhouse gas trajectory using information that it's already collecting. I think this evaluation by COGCC of the industry's greenhouse gas emissions would really be a check to make sure that the AQCC regs are achieving the desired or anticipated reductions. You know, we don't know yet what the AQCC regs will be, but if they're sufficiently stringent, the COGCC's evaluation under this proposal here would be a simple check of a box. However, if industry expands more than expected or the AQCC's regulations don't achieve the level of reductions expected, the COGCC would still have the ability to evaluate permits and their emissions on a timely basis as part of its obligation to minimize adverse cumulative impacts. In sum, this commission, I believe, must address the industry's emissions and ensure it's doing its part to address climate change, which is critical to protecting public health and the environment. It's also consistent with the directives of SB 181 and HB 1261. So I encourage the Commission today to adopt the new rule language in Section 904A and to amend it with the specific changes I described today. So thank you again very much for your time today and for your continued work on this issue. I'll turn it over to Ms. Walker before happy to answer questions.
Yes, I have nothing to add. That's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for your presentation and your participation with us. Do we have questions from commissioners? Commissioner Nanjapa and then Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for the presentation. You know, I really appreciated especially the suggestion with 904B of considering information to evaluate, address, 904A, the information or technologies or measures employed by the operators. I think in general, when we can include more carrots, you know, rather than sticks to help us achieve these emissions goals, I think that's always useful. So I appreciate that. And I wondered if you had also heard the testimony from Dr. McCabe earlier in the day from the citizens groups and about some of the capture technology that exists for tanks and some of the other devices. And you know, this is an area that I am interested in learning more about. You know, what other options do we have to capture those gases that would otherwise be, you know, vented or flared? Do you have any experience or knowledge on some of those existing technologies and how effective they are and how much they are in use at this time?
Ms. Tellinghusen?
Thank you for that question, Commissioner. I heard parts of Dr. McCabe's testimony and I reviewed his written testimony. I think honestly, the technological pieces that he's recommending are sort of outside of my scope of expertise. I will say, you know, I think part of our interest in including this rule or this element of Part 904A was really to make sure that you all and the industry have information on kind of the most cutting edge technologies. Particularly as they are being developed and employed. You know, I think your question about how widespread that technology is, I think is a piece that could be included in that report. You know, this is a new technology that's employed by one operator, or, you know, it's employed broadly across the development area. I'll turn it to Ms. Walker and ask if she wants to add anything to that.
No, thank you.
Commissioner Nanjapa, follow-up?
No, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Great. Commissioner Putnam?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Tellinghusen. I had a couple of questions to follow up, but first wanted to thank you for the thoughtful and creative approach to addressing some of those suggestions and also recognizing the new draft of the roadmap. And I think for the benefit of the parties and commissioners, as we talked about a little bit yesterday, also worth noting the resolution that the AQCC passed last Friday to adopt some of those in sector-based targets, including a target for oil and gas commission, which we can come back to during our deliberations. But wanted to follow up on a couple of the specifics that you had, Ms. Tellinghusen. First, I think in 904A2, related to kind of an update, you had a suggestion on initiatives that APCD and AQCC may undertake. Curious if we do pick that up as a suggestion, does it also make sense to pick up other state agencies in there to the extent that Public Utilities Commission may have beneficial electrification or other sort of initiatives that utilities may drive? The new air quality enterprise may be undertaking some research in those areas, and just kind of curious in the nature friendly amendment, if we do pick that up, whether that's something that would make sense from your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Putnam. I think that's a reasonable suggestion. I think as we were, putting this amendment together, we were mostly thinking, any sort of statewide plan that would have targets for the oil and gas sector would come from the Air Division, but you're absolutely right. It could come from the Energy Office. There could be elements that are developed by the PUC that are relevant. So, I think you certainly could make that language in part 2 a little bit broader, so that it's subsequent initiatives developed by the AQCC or other state agencies to achieve Colorado's greenhouse gas emissions. I think our goal was just that, the roadmap has been developed and is close to being finalized, but certainly over the next 10 years or beyond, there may be other plans or initiatives that come forward.
Thank you, Ms. Tillinghusen. I think you're right, and appreciate the note that it's really the implementation of the roadmap that will ultimately probably be more important than the roadmap itself. And I think that's where you're trying to capture, and appreciate that suggestion. Similar question under, I think, your new proposed 904A5, which related to technologies that industry might be deploying. Again, in the nature of, if we do pick that up, does it also make sense to capture some of the research that the Air Enterprise may be undertaking, when it's up and running, and then other institutions like METEC up at CSU that also are looking at, some of these cutting edge technologies, whether they be in the kind of monitoring area or just actual emissions reductions?
Yeah, Commissioner Putnam, I think that's a good idea. We do have sort of world-class experts in our state developing and looking into these new technologies, so you certainly could include that in that section of the report. But I do want to clarify, I think that we want those technologies or actions or measures to be really measures that are above and beyond what's already required in regulation. So just one friendly clarification there too. But I think your suggestion makes sense.
Thank you, really appreciate it.
Commissioner McGowan, did I see your hand go up? No, okay. Others with questions? I too want to echo the thoughtful suggested edits, and I'm sort of signaling to staff and others that we should be thinking about these.
Thank you.
Great. We will allow you to zoom away and bring our next panel in, Colorado Environmental Advocates and Wild Earth Guardians, for a 10-minute presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Ms. Merlin.
Good morning. Thank you for giving us the time to present today. Let me switch into screen sharing mode and get my presentation pulled up. Okay. All right. Good morning. My name is Catherine Merlin. I'm presenting today on behalf of Colorado Environmental Advocates and Wild Earth Guardians. I wanted to just start with a little bit of background or context, I would say, on an event that was measured at the Union Reservoir in Longmont on March 26th of this year. There was an extreme methane spike. It spiked up to measurement of 35 parts per million, along with a simultaneous spike in benzene and ethane. This was almost certainly an incident of venting. We don't apparently know where it came from or who it was. And I think it's important that the Commission take steps to address issues like that. As further context for my comments, I'd like to point out that the Commission has, as you well know, I'm sure, duties that other agencies do not possess: the mandate to prevent waste and the mandate to protect health and safety. Federal statutes, in particular, give the oil and gas industry special treatment and exemptions in numerous environmental statutes. So here's a list of just a few that the industry is exempt or partially exempt or sees special treatment under. I just want to briefly touch on RCRA, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. Much of the oil and gas industry's waste is exempt from Title C, their hazardous waste. This is a list of the exempt E&P wastes, and therefore it really falls on the Commission to ensure that we're adequately evaluating and disposing of the E&P waste. The CDPHE does not have the same mandate to protect public health, safety, welfare, the environment, wildlife. They also have an additional mandate to consider cost effectiveness and feasibility. Your rules refer to CDPHE's rules in certain points, and I would just like to point out that you're proposing to defer to the CDPHE on some air issues without committing the oil and gas industry to the GHG reduction goals of the CDPHE. So I'd like to say that while the agencies can co-regulate, the more protective standards should always apply. Now I'd like to get into our specific comments. On the general comments on air emissions, just that variances are inappropriate for venting and flaring. Notifications to mineral owners are helpful but insufficient to address waste. That's because mineral owners are often involuntarily pooled, don't have control over their own contracts. When they do voluntarily lease, they're leasing under duress, often with a lack of counsel. And the only remedy for enforcing those mineral rights is through civil litigation. That's difficult and expensive. So please don't rely on the mineral owners to enforce their own rights when the Commission has a duty to ensure the prevention of waste. On venting, as we saw on the first slide, regulatory evasion is easy to perform, it's difficult to detect, and it's difficult to prove. The effects are extremely harmful and dangerous. Therefore, we believe that the penalties should be much higher to sufficiently discourage illegal venting. The Commission should also consider whether there are any available methods to ensure that illegal venting is not occurring. Potentially, there could be some technological solutions to this, random air quality testing, site observation. I'm not sure what else you guys could come up with. I'm sure you could come up with something. And then I wanted to address the definition of venting. This is a problem that we're regulating by definition here. So the way we've defined venting is not simply the intentional release of gas. It's the intentional release of gas with 3 exceptions. There's intentional leaks that are designed into the facility. There's unintentional leaks. And then number 3, this is how number 3 reads. Natural gas, well, I won't read the whole thing, it's highlighted there. If you remove the double negatives, it becomes a quite interesting rule. So if you look at it, venting is not regulated if there's separation occurring, or the separation equipment is sufficiently sized, or the natural gas is sent to the tank during circumstances when the gas can be sent to the gathering line, or the combustion equipment is used to flare, the gas is not operating. So I'd like you to take another look at that to remove the double negatives and examine the and/or structure, or better yet, just don't regulate by definition. It's much better to use the natural definition without all of the exceptions, and then regulate in the body of the regulations. So on flaring, the definition of flaring, likewise, it still wholly excludes storage tanks. I understand that this is because the Commission wants to distinguish between gas that could be recovered and saleable, and gas that might not be recoverable and would be most safely burned off. but it may be possible to recover some gas from the tanks. And we still have to remember that it's still, regardless, flash gas is still gas that is subject to the prohibition of waste. And finally, on flaring, 12 months is just, it's far too long to allow flaring. That is not an upset condition. That is not an emergency. 12 months of flaring constitutes a profound failure to plan and a waste of resources. I wanted to address the issue of radioactive waste. Thank you. I saw that you had added some new language regarding radioactive waste in your proposed rules, but I feel that they don't go far enough. The Rocky Mountain Low-Level Radioactive Waste Board has no authority to address health or safety impacts of the waste management and disposal. There's only one reference to that board's rules, and it only refers to E&P waste that's transported out of Colorado. The only test for T-norm is when produced water is to be put into a pit, and then it's only for radium. This ignores the myriad other potentially contaminated waste and materials. It ignores the potential other storage or disposal method, and it ignores other possibly present radionuclides. The proposed rules are just simply insufficient to deal with radioactive waste. So this is a list of some of the other waste that we can expect to be contaminated with radioactive materials, and that's from EPA. Sorry, my little bar keeps. OSHA was brought up earlier by one of the commissioners. You know, isn't OSHA handling this? And actually, OSHA is not handling this. This is a quote from a 1989 OSHA information bulletin, and OSHA, the federal government, you know, has limited jurisdiction over T-norms, and control was previously left up to the states, which oftentimes did not have adequate programs or staff to deal with the problem. If you go to the article linked to below, The Secret of the Century was put out by Occupational Health and Safety magazine, and it's I consider it to be a must read for information on hazards of T-norm in the oil and gas industry, insufficient federal or state regulation, and the link between EPA exemptions and OSHA underregulation. Public testimony from a former produced water hauler yesterday, that illegal dumping of produced water was common, and the practice was well known to operators who can measure the amount that left the site and the amount that arrived at the permitted facility. There's no regulation requiring disclosure for suspected dumping. And then the discharge that's permitted by other agencies into waters, surface waters, do those regulations meet the Commission's new mandate when there's a potential for high salt concentrations or hazardous pollutants? I think that the Commission should take a second look at that. And then the construction of facilities to withstand 100-year floods. There's just some information on 100-year floods. They're not rare anymore. They can be expected to occur within the lifespan of a typical facility. And geologic hazards are also not being addressed for waste management. UIC injection wells are a proven source of induced seismicity, and geologic hazards increase the danger from oil and gas operations, including waste disposal. So here are my recommendations. I'll read them for you if you like, or I can leave them up. I want you to re-examine the deference that you give to other agencies' rules, redefine venting, and stop regulating by definition, harden the limits on venting and flaring, examine your penalty structure to more strongly disincentivize behavior that is easily hidden, such as illegal dumping and illegal venting. Do not rely on mineral owners to assert property rights to prevent waste, and to require additional testing for radioactive elements in E&P waste. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Merlin, for the presentation. I think leaving it up makes sense. We might have questions about it. Do commissioners have questions? Ms. Merlin, you mentioned one quick question, that 12 months is too long. Did you have an alternative time frame in mind?
You know, I want to be sensitive to the fact that there may be circumstances. So leaving some flexibility in there isn't necessarily inappropriate, but just saying, as long as it's under 12 months, it's purely discretionary. That's just not, I feel, the right way to deal with it.
Thank you. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Merlin. I don't have a question, but I wanted to clarify something that you had up on a previous slide with regard to the definition of venting. There was a typo in there that's pretty significant to the consideration of that language. Notably in subsection C of that definition, one of the circumstances in which venting, or it's not constituted as venting in the definition, is when gas cannot be sent to the gathering line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. So that is correct. What I attempted to do, if you'll look at this highlighted language, I put it in the next slide. I tried to get rid of the double negatives. So unless is a negative, so you take out the negative that is no, you take out not, you take out cannot be. So when you start taking out the double negatives, it gets pretty confusing. And I think there has to be a better way to word this. So I apologize if I've done this incorrectly, but it's pretty confusing. One thing to note is that there's no and in between number 1 and number 2, which I think was certainly probably intended to be there. That if there is separation occurring, and that separation equipment is sufficiently sized, then it could be exempted. But it doesn't make much sense that, if there's separation occurring or the separation equipment is sufficiently sized. Yeah, I think just re-examining the wording of that, or, better suggestion is define venting as, as allowing natural gas to escape into the atmosphere. And then if these are circumstances that you want to treat differently, then do that in the body of the regulations and not by definition.
And I understand, Ms. Merlin, what you were attempting to do with the double negatives. I don't think that all those negatives were related to each other to successfully accomplish a double negative evaluation the way it was done. I just wanted to make sure that the record reflects that we all understand what the rule says and what those exceptions are specifically as they're drafted. And so that's just something that I wanted to clear up. So I understand what you were getting at. I don't think that removing the not and cannot is necessarily a double negative tied to the rest of the rule. But that's just a statement I wanted to clear for the record, so I'll leave it there.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Merlin. I wanted to follow up on the suggestion about the penalty structure, recognizing that we're limited by the statute, which has caps on the penalty, but knowing that we've got kind of discretion within that statutory direction. Did you have particular recommendations either on how to do that? In other words, is that something that you'd suggest that we set by rule or re-examine the penalty policy and enforcement guidance? And aside from the how, do you have any particular proposals on how to ensure that those disincentives are in place?
Yeah, I understand you are constrained in the penalties that you're allowed to assess, but and penalties aren't specifically addressed in the 900 series. In fact, I'm not even sure if it's appropriate to bring up the penalty section in the context of this particular section of rulemaking. My only suggestion is that this behavior is easily hidden, and the tighter that we make regulations on flaring, the more attractive it becomes to deal with problems in another way, and perhaps evaluating whether anything can be done with the penalty policy, or I don't know if there's any incentive. I heard Commissioner, I think Nanjapa, suggest that you were looking for carrots instead of sticks. I don't know if that could be accomplished. I'm sorry, I don't have anything more specific in terms of suggestions.
Other questions? Great, Ms. Merlin, I don't see further questions. Thank you for your presentation. If you could get the slides to Hearings Manager Larson, that would be helpful.
Thank you all so much. Yes.
We continue to thank you for your participation with us. And we will Zoom you away and bring on Earth Guardians, Our Children's Trust, as our likely last stakeholder presentation for the morning session.
Good morning, commissioners. Before I get started, could my co-counsel Maya Kane, who I think is also on Zoom, be added?
Okay, we are looking for your co-counsel.
Mr. Bellinger, I'm sorry, could you please repeat the name of your co-counsel? We didn't have that individual listed on our sheet.
Sorry, it's Maya Kane,
Maya.
Maya, M-A-Y-A-K-A-N-E. There you go. Okay, it looks like Maya's here, so I'll go ahead and get started. So thank you again, commissioners. My name is Nathan Bellinger on behalf of Earth Guardians and Our Children's Trust. And co-counsel Maya Kane is with me today, although I will be the one presenting. And I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So I want to begin by saying that overall, we feel that the proposed changes to Rule 904 will greatly improve the Commission's ability to evaluate the greenhouse gas emissions associated with Colorado's oil and gas development. And we really appreciate the efforts by the CDPHE and Commission staff to collaborate on that information sharing process and to come up with a rulemaking framework to memorialize that. That said, we think that Rule 904 in particular and the 900 series rules as a whole, even taking into account the 200 to 600 series rules, still do not comply with the Commission's obligation to address the oil and gas industry's greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore cannot protect public health and the environment. So before providing information on how we think the Commission should do that, I want to provide some context. So the first and I think most obvious point is that bears reiterating is that in order for the state of Colorado to meet its greenhouse gas reduction targets, which the General Assembly has stated are necessary to protect public health and the environment, the Commission's primary obligation, a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions are necessary over the coming decades. And they must begin immediately in order for the state to meet its 2025 and 2030 targets, which the draft Colorado Greenhouse Gas Pollution Reduction Roadmap notes the state is currently on track to achieve only half of those necessary reductions. The second point that I want to make is that the fugitive greenhouse gas emissions from Colorado's oil and gas industry make up a very substantial portion of Colorado's overall greenhouse gas emissions, around 18%. So as you can see here in the black circle, these fugitive emissions account for more emissions than all the greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector and from the industrial energy sector. And these are just the fugitive emissions. They do not include the greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of those oil and gas resources, which are shown in some of the other wedges here. The third point is that as the draft Colorado roadmap makes clear, all sectors have an important role to play in reducing emissions if the state is to reach its 90% reductions by 2050. But importantly, as you can see here, greenhouse gas emission reductions from the oil and gas sector and the electricity sector are the two primary areas identified where the state needs to focus efforts in the next 10 years. So, of course, the question is, how should the Commission achieve these emission reductions? And there's two primary ways. The first, and I think most effective, is to reduce oil and gas production. And the second is to reduce methane leakage from the production, processing, and transportation of oil and gas resources. And it's our position, based on the evidence in the record, that both are necessary. So just this past September, a new report was released called Committing to Climate Action by one of our experts, Ben Haley at Evolved Energy Research, along with Grid Lab, the Sierra Club, and NRDC. And this report used modeling by Evolved Energy Research to come up with technically feasible and cost-effective ways for the state to meet its greenhouse gas reduction targets. And according to the modeling, the reduction in oil and gas emissions is achieved through both a decrease in oil and gas production and a reduction in methane leakage rates. So I just want to take a moment now to explain the difference between the results in this report and the draft Colorado roadmap, which I acknowledge is still in draft form, but I think it's worth looking at. So if you can first draw your attention to the green circle, this is the core scenario in the Evolved Energy model, which found that the most effective and efficient way to achieve the necessary emission reductions from the oil and gas sector is to reduce methane leakage by 57% by 2030, which they determined was aggressive yet realistic, and reduce oil and gas production by 25% by 2030. In contrast, the state's draft roadmap in the red circle assumes reducing methane leakage by 75% by 2030 and increasing production by 50%, along with a 100% electrification of all vehicles and equipment in the next 10 years. So the main reason for the disparity between the numbers here is that the Colorado draft roadmap assumes a very steep reduction in methane leakage rates. As you can see here in the bottom turquoise line, their leakage rate would go from around 2.5 or 2.4% currently to 0.6% by 2030 and 0.25% by 2050, which the Committing to Climate Action report says is an unprecedented leakage rate. So rather than try to achieve an unprecedentedly low leakage rate, the Evolved Energy Research modeling assumes a slightly higher leakage rate, 1% by 2030 and 0.7% by 2050, shown in the dark blue line, and compensates for this slightly higher leakage rate with a modest reduction in production. So while we fully support ambitious efforts to reduce methane leakage, the evidence shows that it's much more realistic and feasible to reduce production and replace some of that energy source with Colorado's abundant renewable energy sources. This is also more cost effective than trying to achieve an unprecedented reduction in methane leakage. Additionally, and importantly, even if the reduction in methane leakage envisioned by the Colorado roadmap was possible, you still have the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the oil and gas combustion, which will continue to exacerbate climate change and harm Coloradans' public health and the environment. Therefore, in order for the Commission to fulfill its obligations, we think it should promulgate rules that will reduce oil and gas production by at least 25% in the next 10 years. And so one point that I want to respond to is the argument that was raised in some of the filings that even if the Commission requires a reduction in oil and gas production, that will simply result in the state importing oil from out of state. So this graphic compares the greenhouse gas emission reductions by energy sector needed for the state to meet its greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. The top one is the draft roadmap, and the bottom one is the evolved energy research modeling. And one thing is clear from both models is that in the next 10 years, Colorado needs to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all energy sectors and transition towards renewable energy sources. So as I noted, the evolved energy research recommends reducing production by 25% in the next 10 years, during which time the state is expected to see a 30% decline in demand for oil and gas resources. So despite claims to the contrary, the evidence shows that Colorado will not need to import out-of-state oil and gas as it reduces production. The Committing to Climate Action report sums this up nicely, where it says Colorado's policies for energy supply should match its policies on energy demand. It is fundamentally incompatible to say on the one hand that decarbonization requires the state to use less oil and gas by 2030, but on the other hand say that the state should be permitted to produce more oil and gas by 2030. Any comprehensive and effective climate policy cannot be based on Colorado increasing oil and gas production between 2020 and 2030. At the same time, Colorado must reduce oil and gas use by 2030. So in closing, I want to push back on the idea that the Commission can wait to take further regulatory action to address cumulative impacts and stress that the time is now. All of the graphics I've shown today, the evidence in the record, illustrate that in order for the state to have any chance of meeting its greenhouse gas reductions, and more importantly, for us to have any chance of avoiding rapidly escalating and irreversible climate impacts, it's imperative that greenhouse gas emission reductions begin immediately from all sectors, but especially the oil and gas sector. And as if we needed a reminder about what's at stake, this year's record-setting wildfires, droughts, and heat waves across Colorado and the western United States should serve as alarm bells. So on behalf of the 65 youth petitioners on the OCT petition, Earth Guardians and their youth members, and all of the other youth concerned about their futures, we respectfully urge the Commission to promulgate rules that would cut Colorado's oil and gas production by at least 25% in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bellinger, for your presentation. Do we have questions from commissioners? All right, Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, and appreciate the presentation, Mr. Bellinger, and noting the two different studies out there. I just wanted to make one clarification there, that the roadmap scenario was presented as just one scenario that could get there and wasn't designed to be prescriptive in terms of whether it would be leakage rates or other approaches to achieve that. And the rulemaking that's going to be kicking off with stakeholder engagement starting next week does explicitly include the options of both leak rate reductions and production related limits on the table, and looking forward to everybody's engagement on that. So I'm not sure there's this clear a distinction between the two approaches as suggested in your presentation. And I guess the next question is, given that we're going to be going through that process to come up with a rulemaking to achieve those objectives and largely reaching the same point by 2030, what's your recommendation of what this commission does with that at this point within the 900 series rule?
Yeah, thank you for that question and clarification. I think it sounds like maybe both models or reports are in agreement, but I think the bottom line is, and the role for the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission is that oil and gas production in Colorado needs to decline in the coming years. And like I said, we fully support rules to reduce methane leakage, but we think that both from a supply and demand perspective, and also when considering that, you know, Colorado's oil and gas resources, once combusted, will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and further exacerbate climate change. The commission needs to be reducing production of oil and gas resources, even if those resources, regardless of where those oil and gas resources end up being combusted, whether in state or out of state. So as the agency with the regulatory authority over production of oil and gas resources, we think that the time is now for the commission to begin preparing and promulgating rules for that reduction in production that needs to take place in the coming years. And I think that those rules will give all of Coloradans greater certainty about what lies ahead in the future and allow them to start planning for that future.
Thank you, Mr. Bellinger.
Thank you, Mr. Bellinger. Do we have other questions? All right, I'm not seeing any, so we continue to thank you for your participation with us.
Thank you.
We will Zoom you away, and I believe that we are due for our noonish lunch break, and then we'll get to additional parties this afternoon. So let's break now and return at 1:15. That will give us approximately an hour for our break. And so we will reconvene at 1:15.